to Crime in Court. My name is Heather, and this is the rewatch of the 1993 Menendez brothers trial. I apologize, I'm in the dark. I have a migraine today, but I got to get this video started. So let's just begin. We are picking up where we left off, which was in the middle of Leslie Abramson's closing arguments. This is the closing arguments for Erik Menendez. Remember, the boys have separate juries and separate sets of closing arguments. So this is specifically for Erik. And she's trying to, as we left off, she's trying to decipher the difference between the two and make sure that the state isn't combining or putting Lyle's crimes on Erik. So she's trying to kind of separate that. So let's just pick up where we left off.
And as a consequence, he did some things that he regrets. He molested his brother, and he is sorry about it. And I don't bring that up as a judgment against Lyle, but I bring it up as one of the many ways how, over the years, Erik suffered for being Lyle's little brother. Suffered at Lyle's own hands. And Lyle was something of a bully to him when they were younger, but that changed. And that changed around the time they were teenagers. Early, when Erik was about 13. And then his brother, in this incredibly cold, uncaring family, was the only person in his entire galaxy, if you will, not just world, not just universe, the entire galaxy, who showed any regard for Erik at all. Any protectiveness, any love, any caring, any concern. And I think that was the bond that can never, ever be broken in this family, the bond between the two brothers. But it hasn't always been easy for Erik to be Lyle's younger brother. For one thing, Erik Menendez at Princeton Day School is the second Menendez. And it isn't that people didn't like Lyle, it's just that along with a Menendez brother comes the Menendez parents. And Lyle, having been through that school once, I believe Erik testified, when he'd get into classes with the same teachers, there was like already a negative energy because they had Lyle, and along would come Mr. and Mrs. M with their incredible demands on the teachers. But if we fast forward now to 1988, to these theft offenses that occurred in Calabasas, that's where Erik takes the big rap. And both Craig Signorelli and Lyle Menendez get to skate on those two episodes of thievery. And Erik is the one who goes to juvenile court, and Erik is the one who winds up getting that against him on his record. Now, I want to make one comment about that, and I will return to talk about those crimes later. And that comment is this: Mr. Kuriyama did something really quite improper in his opening statement. We have a stipulation that defines for you all the facts that we agreed would be necessary for you to know to deal with those two prior acts, because they were not introduced, and you will have an instruction to that effect. They were not introduced to show that Erik is a criminal. You absolutely cannot do that in a court of law. That is one of the big constitutional no-nos, which is to say, well, since this person committed that crime, he must be a criminal, therefore he must be guilty of this crime. That is absolutely against the rules. The instruction that you will get will tell you, and you have to follow this rule, even though you might have to do some mental gymnastics to comply. The reason that information about the Calabasas thefts was allowed in, and it says this in the instruction, was only because it would help you understand what got him to Dr. Oziel that fateful day, and what his relationship with his parents might have been like. Because there is discussion on October 31st, November 2nd, and on the December 11th tape about what Jose and Kitty Menendez's reaction to Erik and Lyle having participated in those theft offenses, what their reaction was. And I think that's very important and interesting information, how the parents reacted to that. And when I talk a little later about this component of Erik's upbringing, which demonstrated his parents' corruption and immorality, I think those two offenses become very important. But the bottom line is, Lyle being the number one son, Lyle being the one upon whom all of Jose's demands and expectations were placed, Erik gets to take the rap alone for those theft offenses. So here we are in this trial, and you can hear on that tape of December 11th that there is a marked difference between Erik and Lyle in the way they express themselves. And I want to caution you about something, and it's very hard to talk to you about things you don't know about, because I can't tell you about things you don't know about. All I can do is tell you there's things you don't know about, and here's what they are. You recall, in this case, Erik testified in front of you for some separate stuff, and in front of the Gold jury and this jury for much of his testimony. The same is true of Lyle. He testified in front of both juries for most of his testimony, but then just in front of the Gold jury for some parts of it. And you remember that I put on 3 expert witnesses, Dr. Tyler, Dr. Burgess, and Dr. Vickery, to talk about who Erik is, how things happened to him, affected him, and you heard their testimony. But you did not hear the testimony of Lyle Menendez's expert
Counsel, let's confine ourselves to what the evidence was in this trial.
Okay. My point is, what I'm concerned about is that you make certain judgments about Lyle that then spill over to Erik when you don't know everything there is to know about Lyle, because you're not his jury. You're only Erik's jury. And this brings me back to what I was saying in the very beginning. You have to judge Erik based on who he is and what he did and what you've heard about him. I say that because, let's take a look at, let me go and get up my other notebook if I may. Mr. Kuriyama's a little open. I don't say little to diminish the skill. I only say little to diminish the size, because he's going to come roaring back, I'm sure, tomorrow for a much longer time than his opening. one of the idiosyncrasies about a case like this is that in a case where the defense puts on, and we put on 10 times the evidence that the prosecution did, in a case when the defense puts on a lot of evidence, the prosecution gets to use they get two chances at final argument. They get their opening, which he just did, and then they get what's known as their closing. The defense always gets only one argument. Now, in the usual case, when only the prosecution puts on a lot of evidence, the prosecutor's opening argument goes over his whole case, and then if the defense has put on any kind of case at all, they wait, let the defense counsel get up, talk about their case, and refute the prosecution's case, and then the prosecutor comes back and talks about what the defense has said about their defense case. That's how it works. But when basically almost all the evidence in the case is the defense case, what happens is what's going to happen here. The prosecution can sort of hold all their cards and wait until I'm done, and then get up and make a much more extensive argument, and then to my eternal frustration, I do not get a chance to get back up and refute what he says. So that's the reason why I'm going to talk much longer, because I have to do it all in one shot. And he's going to have his chance again tomorrow. Now, I was trying to refer for a moment to the fact that he referred to Ed Fenno having heard, and it's unclear from who, and it's pure hearsay, that Mr. Menendez had to make this huge amount of restitution. And the other evidence you've heard in this case is that that huge number has to do with the total value of what was taken and not the amount that was paid for restitution, because most of the property was still there and returned. Now, what I was going to point out to you is how Mr. Kuriyama's argument was really an argument more properly made against Lyle Menendez. I noted in the thing here, Lyle. Okay. First of all, he was trying to talk about how bad the brothers were the last year, the bad brother year. And the difficulty for him there in talking about Erik is there isn't anything about Erik after these theft offenses that occurred in July of 1988. Erik didn't do anything bad. He didn't give his parents any reason, any rational, normal reason. I mean, Mr. Kuriyama got up here and actually talked about these people as if they were Ozzie and Harriet versus the bad seeds, and that's not what this family was like, and you know that. However far you may or may not be willing to go in accepting how bad the abuse was, these were not normal folks. This was not a normal household, and they didn't raise totally normal children, which is what you would expect. Okay, but in talking about this so-called bad year, he's trying to find things, he's trying to find that somehow, well, I'm not sure what he's trying to do, because he can't possibly claim that all of a sudden in this year these boys transmogrified from where Erik changed from who he essentially and always was to become this vicious, cold-hearted mad dog killer. So, I guess playing on the assumption that you don't know enough about Lyle will make Lyle the vicious cold dog killer and make you simply assume that Erik's the same as his brother, which not a single soul who testified in this court ever said was true. They are not alike. They may have both suffered, but they are not alike. Okay, so first he talked about what Uncle Brian said, and I'll return to Uncle Brian much later on other issues, but he said that
Uncle Brian is Brian Anderson, brother of Kitty, and he still to this day, he does not want the boys to get out. He is like one of the only family members that is really outspoken about keeping the boys in prison. They deserve to be there type of thing. The rest of the family, as we know, has fully come out and supported the brothers and said, yes, we agree that this maltreatment happened and we want to see them come home. So the majority of the family is on the boys' side. And I say boys, but they're men. But to me, they're boys. I say boys because, well, they did it in the news all the time. But also, I just see them as like broken young men that need help. Like they were crying out for help the entire time in that household and never got it.
Talked about Lyle talking back to his, strike that. He said that Lyle and Erik talked back to their mother. And then, of course, he was completely unable to give us any example of that whatsoever. Then he quoted Carlos Peralt saying, Lyle talked back to his mother. Well, Lyle talked back to his mother from the time he was 14. I'm not going to go through the entire defense in Lyle's case, but Lyle had a very poisonous relationship with his mother. This is the mother, I want to remind you, who wanted, when this child was 6 weeks old, to leave him full-time with her in-laws and visit on the weekends on the way up to the ski resort on Friday and the way down from the ski resort on Sunday. That was the testimony of Mary Louise Menendez's very best and dearest friend ever, Faith Goldsmith. So Lyle and his mother had a relationship which started out with rejection and got worse. And he testified that at the point when he stopped what he felt was this weird sort of sexual thing with her, that she became even more hostile towards him than before. And other people have testified. She was incredibly hostile and rejecting of Lyle as a baby, of Lyle as a teenager. Ed Fenno talked about how she would accost him, and that was Mr. Fenno's word, accost him every single morning as he's going through the breakfast room. She would jump on him to start a fight. So Lyle talked back to his mother. No one was ever able to give you one word that Erik ever said in talking back to his mother. But you know what? This whole issue about talking back just amazes me. We were all teenagers, weren't we? And some of us even own a few teenagers or post-teenagers. We have kids. Now, do you want to equate a teenager talking back to a parent with being a homicidal maniac? Because that is the strongest evidence of aggression that they think they have in this case. That these two youngsters talked back to their parents. Now, no one's been able to tell you that it was a talk back that wasn't deserved. or that it was a talkback that wasn't absolutely ordinary, but if my mother had said to me in an endless stream, as Mary Louise Menendez said to her kids, idiot, stupid, dummy, can't you do anything right? Try harder, swim faster, do more, you won't be a Menendez, you're dishonoring the family. You tell me you don't have a right to say, Mom, stuff it. And yet this is considered some critical piece of negative evidence that they talked back to their mother. Now, the interesting thing, as I say, though, is that only one witness says that Erik even did that to her. One witness, and it's her brother Brian, who could not give us a single incident. I think he said, finally stretching, gee, maybe in 1986 in Canada, she wanted him to go somewhere and he didn't want to go, so he was saying no. Well, did he go, Uncle Brian? Oh, yeah, he went. Disobey. No one's ever said disobey. Defy. Refuse to go along with the program. Talk back is the biggest thing. And let's talk about, since I'm diverting, I'm going to do this, because I find this very hard to organize, I'll tell you. This particular case, everything seems to lead to everything else, so we'll freely associate here. I want to just turn this around. I know it's going to disrupt, but it just seems to me that we have to get a little perspective going here. You know, a case like a family is like a little universe. So it's a closed system. Reality becomes what's proven in court, and that's not what's real. That's what becomes the operational reality in a case. And therefore, certain things get distorted, and you sort of have to be brought back to earth. So here it is, folks. The ultimate sin. Shut up. This is Erik Menendez's greatest crime prior to August 20th, 1989. And this is supposed to be proof that he is a killer. Because he said once in his life, when he is 18 years old, to his incredibly overbearing father, who was harassing him on the tennis court in front of everybody and making him crazy, he had the effrontery to say, shut up. Now, when you consider what Jose Menendez, and forget about the sex for the moment, you consider everything else Jose Menendez ever said or did to Erik, okay? They are making this huge big deal out of the fact that he said shut up, when to me what's incredible is that people remembered it. Pat and Brian remembered it because it was so out of character that Erik Menendez would even say at 18 to his father, shut up. And it must have been a very scary experience for him to say shut up to that man. Now, I will tell you that if you don't give a child the right to stand up for themselves, if you so take away their sense of identity, terrible and drastic things can happen, just like they did in this case. And I'll take you into just a little private recollection, which we are permitted to do here. When I was 12 years old, my mother did something that she had never done before. My mother was, may she rest in peace, she died during this trial, in fact. My mother was a very good person, but she had a very bad temper. And she used to use her hands a lot. She was a hitter. But when I was 12, she got really worked up about something, and I don't remember what it was. I must have been lippy. I had a right to talk back. That was one of the things. My mother was very liberal in children having certain dignities and certain rights, in spite of the bad temper and in spite of the hands and the spankings. So when I was 12, I must have said something that set her off, because she got really upset, and she reached into the closet and she took out a wooden suit hanger, you know, one of the like menus with the pants part, and she hit me with it. She had never hit me with a weapon in my life. And I am 12, and because of how I was raised, I was truly affronted that my mother would hurt my physical person that way. She could yell and scream all she wanted. We did that in our family. And she could be as angry as she wanted, but to assault me physically was beyond the pale. And I did something that was the scariest thing I think I have ever done in my life, and it still scares me to think about it. I grabbed that hanger out of her hands, and I hit my mother with that hanger. And I was really frightened after I did that, because I had violated one of the big rules of nature. You do not hit your mother. Now, I never thought, up until that point, that my mother would kill me, but I sure thought when I hit her with the hanger that she would. However, my mother was a normal person. And as a consequence of my having hit her with the hanger, my mother never hit me again, in any way, shape, or form. Because even though we couldn't really talk about it, how offended I was, how insulted I felt, she got the point that you don't brutalize your children that way. And that was the end of that. But it was very scary for me to do something like that, to stand up to my mother. And I can imagine that that shut up cost Erik a lot before he had to pay the price for it later on in the hotel. That it cost him a lot at the moment it was said. And the fact that both Brian, who certainly didn't come here to do Erik any favors, and Pat remembered it, tells me that it was a truly unique experience in the life of Erik Menendez. That shut up. And that's as bad as it is. That's the worst thing anybody can say he ever did to his parents before he was driven over the edge. Now, Mr. Kuriyama also quoting Lyle in Erik's case, said that Mark Heffernan said the brothers were mad at the mother. That's not what Mark said. He never heard Erik say anything bad to his mother. He was attributing that solely to Lyle. And then we move on, and the worst, most egregious example of using Lyle to try to convict Erik here is the December 11th tape. Now, I'm very confused about what the prosecution position is with respect to Dr. Oziel right now. It is very clear when this case began, he was the entire centerpiece of their case. He was, and he is, what they need to prove that this was a premeditated planned killing in order to end parental control, or for hatred. That was his two little constructs that they still seem to be somewhat buying into, at least the control part. But do they really expect you at this stage of this case, after everything that's gone on, to believe Dr. Jerome Oziel beyond a reasonable doubt. I don't think they believe for 1 minute that you're going to do that. I have never seen a witness as destroyed as Dr. Oziel. We got him from every possible direction. His own voice on the tapes that Julian Smith made, where he is making fun of the Menendez brothers, who he claims he's in such fear of, where he is showing that he was not trying to get rid of this woman. She was not pursuing him as he claimed. I mean, maybe I'm too cynical. But from the minute he sat here, one of you is telling me, yes, I'm too cynical. I don't think you can ever be too cynical. Too paranoid, yes, but too cynical, no. The minute he sat here and said to you, in that totally self-assured style of his, that he had to tell Julian Smith, because she was this crazy lady who was chasing him, and he couldn't get rid of her, I thought we had escaped beyond the looking glass. Because that was the single most irrational piece of evidence I had heard in court of law. He had to tell her because he was trying to get away from her? Right, Dr. Oziel. And of course he denied that he had violated the most basic tenet of the psychotherapist's rulebook, which is reveal patient secrets in advance. He denied he did that. He denied she was in his office that night, ready to listen in to the private confidence of Erik Menendez, his patient for a year, who you would have thought he might have had that much sensitivity or loyalty to, but where it became very clear he had absolutely none. This is the depressed and suicidal kid, undisputedly so, who he never treats for suicide, who instead he pumps for details with which he can blackmail him for the rest of his life. Remember, Julian, he says on tape, there's $14 million involved here. Well, there weren't really $14 million involved, but that's what he thought. I mean, from the beginning. You know, and we cross-examined the heck out of them, because you don't run from the Dr. Oziels of this world, you front them off, you face them down. And here is the witness where we brought in character witness after character witness, these women who seem to know him real well, who are telling you that he's the single most dishonest person they've ever run across in their life, as if you didn't already know that. But if you didn't already know that, here are other people to help you know that. But what is confusing and puzzling to me about Mr. Kuriyama's case, whatever it may be, is he is actually arguing in favor of the credibility of both Dr. Oziel and Julian Smith, and that you cannot do. They are definitely a one or the other proposition.
He absolutely did do that. At one point, he was claiming whatever Dr. Oziel had said was true, and then on the 10 minutes later in his argument, he said something about what Julian Smith said, but yet he was just bashing her 10 minutes ago. So, yeah, they don't have a case. I mean, we know the boys did it, but they don't have a case as to proving that it wasn't maltreatment that set them off.
Because she makes it very clear what a manipulative, lying, two-faced, agendized, if you will, a guy with a million agendas of his own, that man is. And she says flat out, I'm there and I'm listening, and he says, no, she's not. And there is no way to reconcile those two people. And what she says in this courtroom, and look, we certainly did not go out seeking Julian Smith to intrude herself into the life of Erik Menendez. She got him arrested. She's the person who went to the police. She's the person who got that search warrant issued. She is the reason he is in jail. No, the reason he's in jail is because he killed his parents. But she's the reason he got arrested, when and how he did. Okay? So this was not someone that the Menendez brothers sought to have in their life. In fact, Dr. Oziel wasn't even someone they sought to have in their life. He was another great choice of mom and dad's. Mm-hmm. But the fact is, and so I don't want to argue her credibility because it's too complicated. I mean, I think clearly there are times when she did not tell the truth in a very big way about whether she heard the Menendez brothers saying things or was merely told by Oziel what they said, because she has told two completely inconsistent stories about the heart of the matter. And I don't know which one is true, frankly. I don't know which one is her real story. But she doesn't belong to me. You know, I didn't create her, and she doesn't belong to me. She belongs to Dr. Oziel. He brought her into this whole mess. And I guess the way to analyze this is, which one of them would you rather have a cup of coffee with? I mean, it boils down to that. Because clearly, you're not going to send anybody you know for therapy with Dr. Oziel. That's clear. And I guess the best thing that, you know, Julian's a very personable, very friendly, bubbly, pretty lady. So I guess the choice is which one do you want to talk to, and that's the one you believe or don't believe either one of them. But the bottom line is you can't believe them both. You can't take, as Mr. Kuriyama tries to do, I think I'll take this little part that helps me from Julian and that little part that helps me from Oziel, and forget about the fact that they call each other massive liars. One thing I do know, Julian's tapes, forget about what she said about what she heard about the Menendez brothers and what she did and didn't hear. Tapes that she made, calculating woman that she is, definitely showed that Dr. Oziel lied to you about both his attitude, about what he said to her, about how he talked about Erik and Lyle on a huge number of issues. And it's right there in tape. And Dr. Oziel, after all, is a person who had his license on probation at the time he first started seeing the Menendez family, all the way through all the times after the shooting of the parents. He's got new complaints filed against him. He's engaged in known criminal conduct for which the district attorney's office managed not to file on him. The same people, the same office that Mr. Kuriyama belongs to, where he got up here this morning and argued that you should accept Julian Smith's word about something or another, is the office that refused to accept her word to prosecute Dr. Oziel for rape when she brought her complaint based on all the horrible things he had done to her. They weren't going to do that. Now, why? Well, this is a real fundamental issue. This doesn't have to do with do they like Dr. Oziel. This doesn't have to do with do they believe Julian Smith. This has to do with the fundamental desire to convict the Menendez brothers. This has to do with whether or not the prosecutors in this case really evaluated evidence because they were interested in truth or because they were interested in winning. Your Honor, I'd like to take a break at this time and return to that theme.
All right, we'll take a recess and we'll resume at 10 minutes after the hour, ladies and gentlemen. Don't discuss the matter with anyone. Don't.
I started to talk about before the break what I think is obvious based on Mr. Kuriyama's argument and things that were done during the course of the trial, which is this desperation that developed in the prosecution to try to put on evidence sufficient to convict Erik Menendez. And that desperation was revealed in Mr. Kuriyama's opening when all he could talk about apparently was Lyle and the things that Lyle had said. And he went through talking about things that Lyle says on the tape of December 11th that he considers as showing a plan. But the point of all this is that is Lyle talking, and you're going to receive an instruction, which I have, but I don't want to dig it out right now, but it's an instruction that is entitled Adoptive Admissions. And it talks about when you can take what one person is saying and use it against another person. And it lays out that the only time that you could find that the things that Lyle are saying you could use against Erik, as if Erik had said them, is if these things are accusations aimed at Erik, and if they're said in a situation where if they were not true, he should have said, no, I didn't do that, or no, that's not true. And it's our position that with respect to this tape recording that Dr. Oziel makes, which he turns on when he feels like, and it runs out in the end, this is not the kind of setting, for many reasons, that some of which you know about, some of which I'll talk about in a minute, Erik should have been expected to refute if Lyle was saying things that weren't true. For one thing, they weren't going to tell Dr. Oziel the truth. So this wasn't a session in which the truth mattered. This was something that was being done to keep Oziel placated because he had been making very suspicious suggestions to Erik and to Lyle concerning his interest in their money, concerning his nervousness, concerning his need to be placed at ease by them. And the fact that Erik took those signs of Dr. Oziel seriously and that he understood that Oziel was potentially threatening to blackmail him, which is clearly what he was up to, is reflected in the testimony of David Morovich. I'm pronouncing it right. That was a friend of Erik's from New Jersey who he met in Cancun. And in Cancun, and this is right after the November 2nd session. This is long before even this December tape is made. And Erik tells his friend David when they're in Mexico that he doesn't trust his therapist. He thinks the guy's interested in his money. He doesn't understand what his agenda is, but he doesn't feel he can really talk to him. So this isn't a session that was meant to elicit truth. I don't know where Mr. Kuriyama thinks Judalon Smith ever said they made this tape in order to show remorse. That's not, no matter how inconsistent she's been, she never said that. And if you want to have all of her testimony reread, such fun. For that purpose, you can do it. You can ask for any testimony to be reread if it's important to your decision making, if you don't feel your notes are adequate, and if there's any kind of issue to be settled among you. In any event, what Mr. Kuriyama does is he seizes upon these things that Lyle says and never really mentions not only what Erik says during the 12-11 tape, but his entire demeanor. Dr. Oziel even testifies that when Erik first comes to him, he is in this really bad emotional condition. One of the things I'd like you to keep sort of like a little balloon hanging over you for a while, at least while you're indulging me and listening so attentively, is this. If Erik Menendez is such a horrible person that he would kill his parents because of A, B, or C, whenever the prosecution figures it out, they'll fill in the blank. If he's such a bad person, if he's such a vicious killer, why is he so distraught afterwards? Immediately afterwards. Now, I know about Mr. Kuriyama and his acting theory. He took a drama class in high school. Therefore, he acted to Detective Edmonds. Therefore, he acted when he was hysterical during the 9/11 call, and he acted when the police came. But I mean, was he acting from the time he was 2 years old? Was he acting when he was this very crying, very frightened, very anxious child? He's such a great actor. How come I couldn't get him on the witness stand to act? Would have been useful if he had been a little more emotional. He was so frightened and so cranked down, you hardly saw any feeling at all in him. But this is their great theory, that he's acting. So I guess he's acting on the 12/11 tape, and he's acting when he goes to Dr. Oziel, and that's nonsense. For one thing, on behalf of all the actors of this world, acting is not lying. Acting means you're in touch with emotions, and you can bring them out when the situation requires it. I mean, that's part one. But part two is Erik was described all of his life as a very sensitive, very anxious, very emotional person, okay? And because he was that kind of person, after he did this to his parents and got arrested and wound up in jail, he was nearly on the edge of a psychotic break. Because he was a sensitive person, because a cold and vicious person wouldn't have been in that condition that Dr. Vickery saw him and wouldn't need medication to get through, wouldn't need medication to testify. There just is a difference between a cold person and a humane and sensitive person. And the kind of crime that Mr. Kuriyama claims happened here is not the kind of crime that a person like Erik Menendez could commit. And that keeps coming through. Even when the most betraying of all people in the world, Dr. Oziel, is on the witness stand, he cannot deny the fact that Erik came to him because he was in extreme anguish. Okay, he was falling apart, he was cracking up, he was feeling guilty and remorseful to an extreme degree for what he did to his parents. And that comes through from Erik, the person on trial here, in the 12/11 tape. However, Lyle deals with his issues. And when you examine the instruction on adoptive admission, you will realize that those things have to be kept segregated as to Lyle. But even if they're not, I mean, they went in there planning to lie. But in any event, Erik is silent during all this time that Lyle is saying these grim things about plans. And Oziel, of course, wanting a double blackmail, wants to get Erik's voice on this tape talking about the killings. So you may remember, or yeah, sure, you remember 5 months worth of everything. Well, maybe you don't remember, but when Dr. Burgess was on the witness stand the second time around, when you're talking about the meaning of this tape, or at least what she takes out of this tape, it's for you to decide what it means. I mean, this is the point, by the way, when you're the experts. It doesn't matter what anybody else has said in this trial. You have absolute, total power, finally. Okay, this is right at the end of Dr. Oziel's speech in which he uses the word control and controlling to describe Jose Menendez 13 separate times. And neither Erik nor Lyle during this entire tape ever use that word. This is an Oziel word. And this is the proof. This tape is the absolute proof, in my opinion, that Oziel made up the story that he testified to, that he claims the brothers said to him on October 31st and November 2nd. He's the only person talking about control. He's the only person talking about hate. He's the only person saying negative things about Jose Menendez. But at the end of his control, and here's one of them, and there's another one, and it goes on and on, he tries to get Erik involved. And Erik is very emotional. He doesn't want to hear bad things about his parents. He starts to cry, and what he says 3 times in this one paragraph is, what I did because I had no choice. Now that is not a plan. Throughout the post-shooting contacts with Erik, he keeps letting out hints, his own set of cues and signs about the truth. He does it with Sergeant Edmonds. When he goes in there and he talks about smelling the smoke, when obviously there is no smoke when they come back at 11:45. The smoke is at the time of the shooting. He's giving himself away. When he talks in September to Detective Zoller, and he talks about, when I was young, I couldn't hurt a living thing. As you get older, life gets colder. He's telling them without telling them, because he is a person with a very active conscience, and it's killing him. And he's trying to let out. He is the confessor. He does give a sort of confession to Craig Signorelli. Not, I would submit, the one Craig came in here, he whose future is somehow wrapped up in this trial. Not the one he testified about, but he clearly told him something, okay? But my point is, this is what Erik is like on that tape. He cries, and he talks about no choice, and he talks about secrets, and he talks about not being able to talk to his parents, not being able to tell the truth, and he's doing what he does all along, which is constantly giving hints of the truth. Now, it would have been nice. I mean, I would much rather be in a trial right now in this case, where Erik Menendez had been arrested at the police station by Sergeant Edmonds, and I wouldn't have to deal with the Oziels and the Julons and the Craigs and all the other self-promoters who have been involved as witnesses for the prosecution in this case. It would have been clean and neat, and I would have much rather heard Sergeant Edmonds, who seems like a real nice guy, his version, with his tape recorder, thank you, of what was said that night, because Erik was on the verge of confessing even then. He can't keep his mouth shut when he's highly emotional and upset. He's sitting there in the police station. Sergeant Edmonds has his tape going. I would have, if Edmonds had just picked up on the clues, if they had just done the gunshot residue test, mind you, I do not blame the police department, but it would have been a much nicer case and cleaner and had real issues and the focus on the real issues if we didn't have to litigate the Oziels and the Judolons and the Signorellis and the meanings of tape. It would have also have been nice, but could not have been part of this case, if Erik and Lyle could have simply, boom, told the truth way up front, sorted this all out, would have been in trial a long time ago, would have been much nicer. Why couldn't they do that, though? Because when children are raised in an environment where lying is the family rule, and it's the family rule because the minute you have a big secret to keep, you learn to lie. There's no way to keep a secret except to lie. So when you're raised in a family where lying is the operational principle, and when in this particular family other kinds of lying are actively encouraged, lie about your grades, lie about your abilities, lie about your accomplishments, lie about the perfection of our family, this is what they're being taught to do by their parents, okay? And when you're in this kind of family where your parents are so intrusive and so controlling, the only way you can have any kind of personal dignity, like me and my mother in the hangar, for example, but they don't have that kind of dignity in this family. They can't talk back to their parents in this family when they're little, when they're growing up. That's why it's so notable when they do it at all. But my point is, every person needs to feel, to whatever degree they're brave enough to assert it, that they're an individual, that they have rights as a person. And Erik testified, and Ed Fenno testified, and Lyle testified, that when they were teenagers, when Erik was 17, 18 years old, he lied to his parents to keep some measure of privacy in his life. This is a mother who's tapping his phone. This is a mother who examines his genitals until he's 15 years old. This is a mother who apparently stole his diaries. These are people who are so involved and intruded in their children's lives. The only way those children have any kind of separation is, I'm not going to tell them where I'm practicing tennis, and I'm not going to tell them what girls I'm interested in, and I'm not going to tell them those minor details. And that's a way, it's manipulative, yes, but it's a way to preserve some sense of yourself. So they learned through their whole life, for various reasons, how to lie, and they learned how to be afraid to tell grown-ups the truth. Now, you've heard testimony from our experts that children who are abused, not just molested, but in other ways abused, find it very hard to trust grown-ups because they've been betrayed by grown-ups, find it very hard to tell what happened to them. That's any child who's been abused in any abusive family has that in common. In this family, though, the notion of not trusting people was taught as an affirmative lesson. You might remember the story that Carlos Barral told, that Lyle also told, that Erik doesn't remember. Of course, he could have lied about it and made up that he remembered it, but he didn't. About him being encouraged to jump into his father's arms. And he was encouraged to do this repeatedly. And then at one point, Jose refused to, just didn't catch him, and the kid crashed to the floor on his face. And his father said, that will teach you not to trust anyone, even your own father. And it was a good lesson in that family, not to trust your father. But when you do that to a little kid, they never trust anybody. So yes, the Menendez brothers lied after they were arrested. And that has made our life, lied rather before they were arrested. And that has made our life as their lawyers and their life as the accused much more complicated. But there is a theory that permeates the prosecution here, which is not based on reason. And that theory is, once you lie, you can never tell the truth. And that's not true. Even people, even kids who were raised to lie in certain circumstances can tell the truth. And it's our position here, and you are the judge of credibility, that Erik Menendez told you the truth about why these killings occurred and what happened in his background. Now, mind you, you have a right to be skeptical of people who have lied. You'd be a fool not to do that. And that is why we put on all those family witnesses with all those little tiny details that might have seemed extremely stupid to you in a murder case when we first put them on. You know, what does this have to do with August 20th? Mrs. Bozanich kept asking. And the point was, what it had to do to bring in the family members and the teachers and the coaches and the friends and anybody who had information was to show that what Erik was testifying to was not a lie. His family really was this sick. It really was a dreadful and strange place to grow up. And I couldn't expect you to accept just his testimony on that because he has clearly lied to other witnesses who were going to be involved in this case. So we put on a lot of witnesses in order to corroborate, to confirm anything and everything that we could. Now, we had the naked pictures, and they were there, and they're still there, and they're still, as Dr. Burgess testified, the strongest corroboration of the molestation. And we have Erik's cousin Andy, who also corroborated it, and we have other witnesses who corroborate other aspects of the weird behavior in this family, in the hopes that you will then understand that even though someone has lied before, and even though, yes, his life is on the line, he is not lying to you. And the best method, you know, in a trial setting to determine whether someone is lying or not is to cross-examine them. And what's interesting here, of course, is that, as I said before, Erik was not cross-examined about the most important aspect of his maltreatment as a child, which was the molestation. They just want to ignore it. Just don't make him repeat it. Oh, God, I want to hear it again. Well, you're going to hear it again because I'm going to tell you about it in a little while. All right, so therefore, where that gets me back to is, that's right, they're not being honest with Oziel, but, you know, Oziel isn't honest, you know, with every breath he takes. So it's sort of a fair match. Would you trust Dr. Oziel? And whether you would or not, they came in here and they told you what they were lying about and what they were not lying about. And to me, what's most important about the December 11th tape is how Erik sounds, what he's saying, and what he's suggesting in the things that he does say to Dr. Oziel. This is the page where he starts talking about how he loved his parents. It doesn't matter what they actually were. He's uninterested in this evaluation of them. This led up to the fact, now this isn't a plan, this is a series of events where I had no other choice. I would have taken any other choice. I realize what people are worth. I regret it. I may not have had a choice at the time. I regret it. And then I think he says one more time, someone talking about his father, this idolized person in his family, and almost had no choice to do what I did, and I hate myself for doing it. And I don't think there's anybody who could say that he doesn't hate himself for doing it, and that the kind of person who would hate himself for doing it didn't do the kind of crime that the prosecution in this case wants to convince you was committed. But we were talking desperation, and the fact that they're trying to make you think that it's Lyle on trial here is part of their desperation. And this is the most desperate move of all. This is Detective Valentine. Now, Mr. Kuriyama makes a big deal out of the Big Five, and this is the Big Five in Santa Monica. It just overblows. Erik Menendez is on the witness stand for 10 days. He is not the wellest duck in the world, and you know that from Dr. Vickery. He has one of the worst backgrounds I'm sure any of you have heard about, and he is sit there and grilled day in and day out by Mr. Kuriyama. And in the course of all of that grilling and drilling, it really wasn't anything Mr. Kuriyama did. It was simply the fact that they found out that the Big Five stopped selling handguns in '86, that they were able to confront him with anything at all. Okay, and I'll show you where Mr. Kuriyama is exaggerating what he thinks he got with Erik Menendez on the stand. But 10 days. All right? And they were not able to prove that anything he said was actually a lie. Maybe he exaggerated that contact in the store, but I'll get back to that a little bit later when we talk about credibility. But then the prosecution goes, at the end of their case, their first rebuttal witness, and puts this perjurer on the witness stand. And what's so offensive about putting Detective Valentine, NYPD, on the stand is they know he's going to lie. They put him on knowing what he's saying cannot be true. Why? Because, as this limousine record would show, and as we know from testimony anyway, Lyle Menendez is on his way to Los Angeles in this foolish effort to do something with the home computer on the morning of August 31st. He catches a 6 o'clock flight. He's at Newark Airport at 5:50 in the morning, and they know he's flying back here. You may not remember, Mr. Kuriyama talked about the Haymans, which is the husband and wife, the pregnant lady and the husband computer people. But there's another computer guy, Howard Witkin. Howard Witkin's at the house early in the afternoon with Lyle Menendez, where Lyle is having him. Remember, the disc does get erased. Gets erased the day before, gets erased by Howard Witkin. Lyle Menendez is in the house. He had to get from New York to Los Angeles, and the Concorde doesn't fly between New York and Los Angeles. So he's flying out of Newark on a Delta flight, and the flight leaves at 6 o'clock in the morning. And Mr. Kuriyama and Mrs. Bozanich know darn well Lyle is here in Los Angeles and in an airplane, on an airplane getting here from the early morning hours. Okay, but what they put this guy on anyway, knowing he's not going to tell the truth, to testify that he saw Lyle Menendez at the U.S. Open the next morning, among his many other lies. And I'm going to take you through them now. I call Mr. Valentine, there's a certain category of witness in this case that is created by that infernal contraption in the corner. We oppose televising this trial. And the reason that defense lawyers generally do not want trials televised is because you get, particularly the way this one's been televised, you get what I call the volunteers. People who want their 15 seconds of fame, who want their face plastered on everybody's television set from New York to Los Angeles, and who listen to these trials and then pretend to have evidence to give in the case. They do their little research, watching what other people say, and then they roll on in here for their place of glory. Valentine is one of them. Grant Walker is another. Miss Pisarchik is a third. I will assume that Miss Browers is just extremely confused. But let's start with Mr. Valentine. I have a few pages here because page after page of perjury is relatively unusual, even in Los Angeles County trials. going to swing the mic around so the evil eye can also hear. Now here's the story that Mr. Valentine tells, that on the Wednesday night before, the 30th, he reports to the Sheraton Center Hotel, and first he goes to the U.S. Open, he can't find anybody there, but down at the bottom of the page, he reports to the Sheraton Center and he, quote, finds the clients. If I read the small version, then I don't have to block the big version. I finally found the clients, he says on line 28. And on the next page, lots of objections. I learned that I can find the clients. Who did you actually come in contact with, he says? Lyle Menendez. Now, this is at the Sheraton Center Hotel Wednesday night. Now, they know they're going to call Pat Heffernan as a witness in order to testify that she loaned her American Express card to Erik. Okay? They're in touch with her. She's going to be a witness in the case. This is not a mystery. This man is claiming that he sees Lyle at the hotel, and he goes on. He says he sees the girlfriend. Now, this guy's been watching TV because there's been lots of testimony up until this point about Lyle's got this girlfriend, Jamie Pisarzik, on and on. Okay. They're going to call Mrs. Heffernan. They put this guy on to say these things. They talk to Mrs. Heffernan. They know they're not true. Mark Heffernan has already been a witness in this case and is then recalled again. They know this is not true. They are putting on perjury, this is known as, lying under oath in a big way. So he says he sees Lyle. He sees Lyle's girlfriend. Mrs. Heffernan testified no way Lyle's not there. And he even goes so far as to describe the girlfriend as looking like me. No, thank you. And she's a lot younger. And then he says he spends the night sitting outside, and then he goes to breakfast. And then where do they go? They go to the U.S. Open, right? Now, you may remember it's not an item of evidence here for technical reasons. But Mr. Kuriyama asked Mr. Valentine, there was this pay sheet of some kind, this record, which indicated what he had done, because he gets paid for hanging around on chairs in hotel rooms, outside hotel rooms. And this is supposed to be the record of his activities while he's bodyguarding Erik Menendez. And he looks at this record, and yes, it refreshes his recollection as to how many hours he spent with him, but gee whiz, golly gosh, it's wrong, because it doesn't show this early morning trip to the U.S. Open. Yes, it doesn't show it because he didn't take it, but he claims it was a mistake on the form. And the form, unfortunately, is not a piece of evidence, but his testimony about it is. If you have any doubt about it, you can hear that testimony. But here he is off on his fantasy trip to the U.S. Open by limousine in the wee small hours of the morning. And he and Erik and Pat and Mark Heffernan supposedly go to the U.S. Open. Pat testifies no way, she went shopping, and Mark went to his lecture. He was there for a seminar. All right, but Detective Valentine tells you that they all drive off to Flushing Meadow to go to the U.S. Open. They, he goes into detail. He's asking all about the arrangements for the limousine, on and on. And he's asked, the limousine driver drove you to the U.S. Open? The U.S. Open. How far is it? 15, 18 miles. And once you got there, who was there? Why, Lyle and his girlfriend are there. Now, Lyle is apparently astrally projecting himself from the airplane that he's in, flying to Los Angeles to meet Detective Valentine at the U.S. Open with Jamie. Anyway, he says he goes to the U.S. Open, and then he goes so far as to say he also accompanies Erik to LaGuardia, but now he says they have to go back to the hotel after the U.S. Open, and then they go to LaGuardia. And that's what he says here. No, we had to go back to the hotel. And he gets to such detail in his lie about the U.S. Open. First, when I take him on cross, he talks about actually watching tennis matches, and they were female players, and he wasn't sure if it was doubles or singles, and they went in the back way, and they didn't have to pay. They were in the stands, but first they went to the practice courts, and on and on and on, heaping lie upon lie upon lie upon lie, with a straight face. And then he says, of course, that they then go to LaGuardia Airport, and on the way, they have to make these stops at these computer stores so that Erik can get a program for his computer. Now, it is clear Detective Valentine's been watching the case. And it is clear he's here to help the other detectives, the ones who were actually assigned to this case, and to help the prosecution. Because his evidence doesn't even make any sense, but he obviously hasn't figured that out. No one claims that Erik did anything to the computer or tried to erase the will. By the time Erik gets back to Los Angeles, Mr. Wittgen's already been there, he's already done whatever he's done. It isn't even an issue. But it's just to make Erik look dirty. It's just to make him look like he has some interest in what's on the computer. It's just this desperate effort to make this basically good kid look like the vicious killer Mr. Kuriyama needs to create to get the conviction he wants. So here is Valentine talking about stops at computer stores, okay? And he's elaborate. He gets out. He's got a bodyguard. Now, I start to point out to him, of course, that you're not going to find too many computer stores on the long leg of this journey from the 59th Street Bridge to LaGuardia. You're going through some really bad neighborhoods in Queens, in New York, industrial and low income, and there just aren't any computer stores. So, of course, he then shifts and says, oh, it was in Manhattan. And it's real easy to park in Manhattan, go and cross down to the bridge early in the morning to go into these computer stores. It's as easy as our flying pig. But what's more important is this record here. And Guy DeLisio came and testified about it. It's sitting right there. This is not a secret, this document. This document is available and is shown to Valentine on the witness stand, of course, shown to the prosecution first. And obviously, there are no stops at computer stores. There's no trip to the U.S. Open. This is what I mean when they say they know they're putting on a liar and they just don't care. Because here's the proof that he's lying. That plus the records of his own work, which doesn't show this trip to the U.S. Open. But that does not, deter the prosecution in this case. So then he finishes telling his lies about the computer store, and claims the limo driver stopped. You heard Delicio say if he had made a stop, he has to note it. He remembers they didn't make any stops. And what's really shocking about Valentine is I tell him, Detective Valentine, we already know you're not telling the truth here. We know Lyle's on the airplane. We know he's in Los Angeles that afternoon. Now, don't you want to sort of fix your testimony? Oh, no. I'm definite. I saw Lyle Menendez at the U.S. Open that morning. And, we show him the record. Oh, I don't know how to read this record from the limo driver. And, and this is a very different reaction. This perjurer is a very different reaction than what happened when Mr. Kuriyama confronted Erik with the fact that he had obviously either exaggerated or misconstrued the conversation in the big fight. Because what does Erik say when he's confronted with the fact that handguns weren't sold there? He says, I must have been wrong. I must be mistaken. I must have misunderstood the conversation. Or it must have been another story. And you will remember when he's on the witness stand and he's talking about the fact that in June of 1988 his mother bought a rifle. And this is a rifle that we know still exists because Carlos Barral gave it to this officer Martinez to transport here to California so that they're now here. But in any event, his mother buys that rifle in June 29th, 1988, and she buys it at a store called Best Products. And here is the receipt, and there is her very distinctive handwriting. You will see that you can really tell what is Mary Louise Menendez's handwriting. And she signs the receipt for the purchase of the rifle. And I show it to Erik on the witness stand. He says that his memory is that he and his mother went to Sports Mart. So I'm showing him the receipt for Best Products. He says, well, it wasn't Best Products. He's insisting it isn't Best Products. It's clearly the receipt for the rifle. He's not real good on what places he's been in and the names of places. And we hadn't even heard at that point the testimony we later heard that when he was tested at the Lewis School, this happens to be a particular problem of his. I think it's called dysnomia. He gets the names of things wrong. He gets the names of places wrong. And I don't think that we knew that at the time he was testifying about the rifles, and we certainly didn't know that at the time he was testifying about the big fight. But when he's confronted with the fact that he is wrong, that what he said can't be true, he admitted it, and he tried to explain what might have been wrong with his memory, but not old Andy Valentine. No, he insisted that it doesn't matter what evidence we have, he is telling the truth. And of course he told the truth about nothing except that Erik was taken by a limousine, which I proved through Guy Delicio, to LaGuardia Airport that morning. And Valentine's not important in any great cosmic sense, but he is important to the extent that you rely on the representations made by the prosecution in this case because their intentions aren't good. This is supposed to be a truth-seeking process, and that seems to get lost sometimes in the contest aspect, and this one was hard fought, and that does happen. There's no excuse for ever putting on a witness like this, but there is some excuse for some of the contest. And let me give you an example. If you heard a lot of things that you didn't need to hear, that aren't going to help you decide this case, that were just wound up in the long run to be noise. One of the reasons is, in the beginning, the prosecution thought they could prove certain things that it became very clear to them later they couldn't prove because they weren't true. Things about the Menendez family, for example. Things about the parents. And so there was this whole long thing about keto. Now, I'm going to have a few laughs about keto, but the point of putting on Mrs. Hertz, and this happened when I wasn't here, the day that I wasn't here, I read the transcript, obviously. Mrs. Hertz, who's that little blonde lady who was a teacher at PDS and a friend of the Menendez's, was called to testify and did testify to something that other witnesses have talked about, the fact that Kitty Menendez was acting very peculiarly in August, specifically August 1st, 1989. Now, we don't put on evidence that Mrs. Menendez acted peculiarly because we think that she deserves to die because she's peculiar, or to make her look bad. The whole point of all of this is to try to make you understand what did Erik see in his mother. What is she to him? Why does she ultimately become as frightening, if not more so, a person than his father? And unfortunately, people who are sort of in charge of your life, people who are the grown-ups, people who you have looked up to and looked to for guidance, when they go off, it's very scary to kids. It's very alienating and it's very scary. And even at 18, you can still be a kid in relation to your mother. And we just put that on to show that she was acting quite bizarrely in August of 1989. And it struck Mrs. Hertz as strange that Kitty would bring up in the middle of a completely unrelated conversation the fact that she was soon going to be traveling to Quito, that she had relatives there. And it was strange because she had never heard it before, and she's from South America, so she thought she would have heard it before. So she thought it was peculiar. Now, at first, and during Erik Menendez's cross-examination, for example, the prosecution's position was Mrs. Hertz got it wrong. This wasn't Quito, Peru, which of course we know doesn't exist. It is Ecuador. This is Kalamazoo, which is in Michigan. I mean, this is nonsense. But this is how things can get distorted just through the adversarial process, if you will. And Mr. Kuriyama is determined to prove that Mrs. Hertz was wrong and it's really Kalamazoo. So he has Erik Menendez on the stand, and while he's cross-examining him, he asks Erik, now, you don't even have relatives in Quito, Peru. What does Erik know? These are parents who never talk to him. How would he know where he has relatives? He says, no, we don't. And then the same prosecution calls Brian Anderson to testify that, yes, they do have relatives in Quito, and yes, she was playing on and on and on. All right. The only thing significant about Quito's statement is that it's completely out of context when it's made. She's telling Alicia Hertz she's going to go very soon. Brian Anderson claims she's going to go in the winter. That's that. But a lot of heat and light is sometimes spent on things for no good reason, but just for the fight. And that's what concerns me. How much of what the prosecution argues here is just for the fight, and how much of it is the search for truth. Now, I've talked to you about circumstantial evidence in order to find that what happened here was a first-degree murder, you have to find what the prosecution so desperately wanted from the discredited Dr. Oziel, which is a plan. Because without a plan to kill, the only evidence that they have that is at all ambiguous is the purchase of the guns 2 days before. And that is circumstantial evidence that points 2 ways. Either they're going down there, as Mr. Kuriyama argues, because they want to conceal that they are buying guns because they're planning to kill their parents. That's a series of inferences. There is another set of logical inferences, that they are going to San Diego because they're going to San Diego, or for any reason, or to buy guns. That yes, they don't want their parents to know they're buying guns, given the fact that they're afraid. I mean, this is just, if you just accept for the moment the defense theory, the going to San Diego is not inconsistent with it. That they use false ID, not because they're trying somehow to hide, although hiding the fact that they're buying guns does not necessarily prove. It's just a circumstantial evidence fact. It doesn't prove they're planning to kill their parents any more than it disproves that they're planning to defend themselves against their parents. You wouldn't want these parents to know, let's assume hypothetically the parents are in fact planning to kill them, as they believe. Okay, let's just assume they're right. This is what they believe, this is what the parents are doing. You wouldn't want them to know you're about to make plans to defend yourself. You're just going to bring them down on you all the sooner. They'll just find some other way to get you. They'll make sure you can't defend yourself. So you don't want them to know you're going to San Diego. You don't want them to know you're buying guns. But the fact of the matter is, with respect to the use of Donovan Goudreau's driver's license, just happened to be the only driver's license they had on them. Lyle's was suspended. The records are in evidence. Eric's, he had lost. His tickets for driving without his license, for having lost it, his DMV record is in evidence. That's totally corroborated by government documents. You don't get better than that. Okay? So they didn't have a license. They had Donovan's, which he left behind, which Erik picked up because he needed an ID to get into clubs, and he used it. I mean, it's that simple. And the prosecution wants to make a big deal out of the fact that it looks like such elaborate planning to use a fake ID. And it would. If he had used a fake ID, they couldn't possibly be linked to them. But the whole reason, I mean, all of this evidence, including, this is the photograph of the Big Five in San Diego, about the Big Five in San Diego, was developed by the police because they used an ID of someone intimately linked with Lyle Menendez. So they're not, for example, they could have used, if they had been planning, the Richard Stevens ID that Erik had obtained. This was an ID in a completely false name, and although it had his picture, the way you run a check on something is you run the name, obviously. So Donovan Goudreau was a name that meant something to the Beverly Hills Police Department, but Richard Stevens wouldn't. He doesn't exist. He's a made-up person. So if you're really trying to hide, and if you're trying to negotiate a transaction surreptitiously with no trouble, aren't you better off using a license that can't be traced to you by name, where it's got your own picture so it can't even be questioned? But they don't do that, because that tells you they weren't planning at that point to buy these guns. They don't use the more logical, truly fake ID that they have. Moreover, it's interesting. I wonder if the Big Five in San Diego has changed their equipment, because everything that goes on in this courtroom is known. There was testimony. Here are the surveillance cameras that look over the gun counter at the Big Five in San Diego. And the notion that they're buying these guns based on this elaborate, thought-out plan to avoid detection, and yet they're in a store that has surveillance cameras, and they don't know that they're fake. Detective Zoller testified that he discovered in talking to the people at Big Five that their surveillance cameras are fake, but there's no way to tell that if you're a customer. I assume they want you to believe if you're a customer just the opposite. And so the fact that they pick a store like this rather than some little place where there isn't any surveillance cameras also tells you they're not really thinking this through. And the point of this is, you're either looking at a plan or you're looking at panic. You're looking at people who are desperate and are scrambling to prepare to defend. Now, preparing to defend is not the same as a plan to kill. And the easiest example I can give you is if you're living in a neighborhood, for example, where and I think I gave this as a hypothetical to Oziel as well. You're living in a neighborhood that's been hit with a rash of burglaries, and you become nervous about it, and you decide, as many people do, that you want to protect your home. So you go out and you buy a gun. Now, are you planning to kill a burglar? No. Have you considered that you might have to? Well, obviously you're buying a gun. And if you're buying a gun and you're a rational person, you must be thinking on some level, I may have to use this gun. Otherwise, it isn't going to protect you very much in a tight spot. But
I just want to say, she's like verbalizing all the things that I've been thinking throughout this trial, but she's pinpointing a lot of things that it's like, duh, common sense. Like, just because they went and bought the guns doesn't necessarily mean that it was a plan. It didn't mean that they planned on lying in wait, as the prosecution says, and waiting for just the right time to take their parents out. No, that's not why they bought them. There's other reasons you could buy a gun, obviously.
There's all the difference in the world between planning to kill somebody, planning to kill a burglar, and preparing yourself to defend yourself. But from the outside, it looks exactly the same. You go and you buy a gun 2 days before the gun is used. Is it a plan? Is it preparation? It is a piece of circumstantial evidence, and it is subject to the rule that I read to you before about how to interpret circumstantial evidence. The other thing in analyzing, is this a plan or is this panic and preparation, is this. If it is what Mr. Kuriyama wants you to believe, a thought-out plan to kill, they didn't want any more, control. Like I said, they hated, they didn't want control, they wanted money, whatever the theory may be. What's the hurry? This is the part that they have never addressed. If this is a plan to kill, why can't they wait 2 weeks to get handguns, which are quieter and therefore less likely to be detected? And if you're going to plan, obviously, the whole point of a plan is to A, accomplish what you're planning, which is bring about the death of someone, if you're planning to kill, and B, get away with it.
Right.
Okay, that's the whole point of a plan. As Dr. Burgess testified, that's the whole notion when the FBI does their analysis of crime scenes, and they're trying to figure out, is it planned, is it not planned? Planned to avoid detection is what that means.
And if you look at the steps that the boys take, they really didn't think about being detected or being identified. They didn't even wash their hands afterwards, so they probably had the gunshot residue all over them when the police came to investigate and when they were called to the house after the 911 call. The boys still had GSR or gunshot residue still on their hands, and they did change clothes, but they hadn't showered. I'm sure I don't know. They didn't investigate the boys, obviously. They didn't do a GSR test on their hands. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in the same position and they wouldn't have lied with everything about everything. They realized afterwards that, hey, we might be able to get away with this because no one came. And the cops didn't come right away, which is what they thought. So they were like, okay, well, then let's get rid of the shotgun shells, get rid of the weapons, change our clothes, all that. They did.
So if you're planning, and it's obvious you could either buy a nice quiet handgun or a great big booming shotgun, why would you ever buy the shotgun? Well, the answer is when you cannot wait. And when can't you wait? When you think someone's trying to kill you, now. But if all you're doing is deciding, well, it's been 18 years, I think we've had enough of this stuff now, so I think I'll just off the folks, there is no reason why you have to do it that weekend. There's always going to be 2 more weekends or 3 more weekends. And I suspect Mr. Kuriyama will come back with some notion, oh, but Lyle was going back to college. Oh, but Lyle lived on airplanes. I mean, everybody in that family was in Princeton or in Los Angeles every other week. So that does us, and moreover, we don't know when Lyle was going back to college, when Lyle was due to be there. We've heard something about his mother having to be there to help him furnish his condo. The one that they bought for him, that the parents bought for him, somewhere in mid-September, that the condo was closing escrow somewhere around September 9th. But it's not like they weren't coming back. It's not like if this was really something that the two of them needed to accomplish or wanted to accomplish, that they couldn't have waited 2 weeks to arm themselves with something that would not have woken half the neighborhood. So the very fact that that there is haste involved tells you it isn't the plan. Mr. Kuriyama says, oh, they're trying to conceal it because they don't use the credit card. They're trying to defend themselves against the people who get the statements on the credit card. I mean, do we understand this? And they're not sure. I mean, if they really were planning to kill their parents, they would have used the credit card because the parents would have been dead when the statement came and they wouldn't have known. They wouldn't have figured it out, right? But the fact is,
That's an excellent point. Excellent point.
they're not really planning to kill their parents. They're planning to defend themselves and hope it doesn't come to that. Either way, it doesn't make sense to use you can use the family credit card if you're really planning to kill him, but if you're not planning to kill him, you might have to explain that to Pop. What's these 2 shotguns in San Diego, son? You don't want to have to do that, not with Jose Menendez. Now, the other thing when we focus on the gun purchase, which is their strongest piece of evidence, I mean, this is as strong as it gets about planning, is the purchase in San Diego. But if they're really planning to kill these people, and this is thought out, and this is weighed and deliberated, and I will get to show you the definition of first-degree murder, it requires real thought and choice. It requires deliberation, just like what you're going to go in there and do, deliberating, weighing, evaluating, all of that. If that's really what's going on, how come they can't figure out to buy the right ammunition right off the bat? Now, Miss Geyer, and I have a flip chart that features her as well, testifies that in August, it's the beginning of the game hunting season. And so the Big Five has got stacked up in the center of the store all these boxes of ammunition for hunting, which is game load ammunition. I bet you remember that. I remember that. And I showed Detective Van Horn. He took a part for you. He was the sheriff's detective who had the shotgun and was showing you how shotguns worked and patterns and that stuff. A game load of the same brand of ammunition that Detective Van Horn said was used here. And he could tell the brand because of what was left over, the waddings that came out of the shell casings that were still at the scene. He knew it was this Italian brand, which is Fiocchi or Fiucci, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. And it's game load, and that's what Mrs. Geyer said was at the store, and that's what Lyle testifies he picks up on the way up. Don't even have a discussion about what's the proper ammunition if you're really determined to kill somebody. You just pick up what's on the floor. And I think there are other pictures of the store that show that there's ammunition behind the counter that they could have inquired about if they were really thinking at that point that absolutely they're going to have to use these guns to defend themselves. But what ultimately happens is they go back home Friday night, and then the mother tells them the time of the boat trip has been changed, and because they are paranoid, having been raised in fear, and they are fearful because of these things that have happened that week and the confrontations with the father, then they get scared even more. So Saturday morning, they go off to buy, well, Erik, first of all, when you talk about a witness, by the way, who's lying, Erik tells more bad things about himself that you wouldn't have known about if he didn't get on the witness stand and tell them than any witness I've ever seen. But he testifies that that Saturday morning, they go to a gun store here in Van Nuys that Detective Zoller confirms exists, that he describes accurately, okay? And it's called Gun World, what's it called? The Target Range in Gun World, that's what it's called. And this is a place that has a firing range, and he picks it so that he can go there and fire the gun because he doesn't know how to use it, and he's worried now, seriously concerned that he's going to have to use it, and he wants to practice, and he admits all that. Now that's, you could take that and make something out of it as a prosecutor. Aha, he wants to make sure he gets his aim right when he kills his parents. You could argue that, but this is information that Erik is giving you that they didn't know about and could never have proven. But they go that morning, and they buy the bigger ammunition, and you hear this from Erik Menendez and from Lyle Menendez, and you hear Erik's purpose is to practice, and Lyle's purpose is to make sure they've got the right ammunition because they are more frightened now. But the point of all this is if they really were planning, they would have planned to find out about ammunition at the 3 previous gun stores they went to. Whether it was a Big 5 in Santa Monica or somewhere else, no one's disputed that wherever they went didn't sell shotguns. It's shotguns, it's just handguns that they supposedly didn't sell. And so they could have bought it there, I suppose. They could have asked about ammunition and options. They testified that when they went down to San Diego, they went to a smaller place first and talked about shotguns for protection, but they didn't buy there because they were being so uncertain. They were afraid they were attracting the suspicion of the owner. And then they wind up in the Big 5 in Santa Monica, and then they wind up at the Target Range and Gun World here in Van Nuys. 4 gun stores. Now, prosecutor could argue, my goodness, isn't that evidence of planning? They're absolutely determined to get this ammunition and these guns and off their parents. But all of that information came from Erik and Lyle Menendez. All the prosecution knew about was that they bought a Big 5. So why would they lie to make themselves look bad? Why would they say I went to the Big 5 in Santa Monica or a similar gun store if it wasn't true? Why would he say we tried to buy handguns? Because what does that tell you? I mean, handguns aren't even as good for self-defense, frankly. You know, a shotgun stops people. But that's what he testified to because that's what was going through their little heads that day. They had very little experience in the world, these two. And they are now running around together in this panic. And they are giving up this very negative stuff about what they're doing. And there was no reason to tell it, let alone lie about it. Okay. Now, apart from this one piece of activity before the actual shootings, the other evidence, physical evidence in the case, all of which is circumstantial evidence, definitely demonstrates that there was no advanced plan. We call Dr. Burgess to testify about this, but you really don't need an expert per se to tell you what's pretty obvious, okay? And it's got to be pretty obvious that you would never, ever plan, if you had a choice, to fire multiple rounds from a shotgun inside a residence in a densely populated area. Now you saw, the videotape that we did of Elm Drive was for the purpose of showing you one thing. Not how pretty the houses are, how big they are, that's true, but how close they are. How close this house is that this family had lived in for nearly a year. And we showed you that to show if someone is calculating and planning in this premeditated way, they're going to realize you're going to shoot off these guns right in a house, in a room that has almost a solid wall of French doors. Right? And they shoot the guns in such a direction, they blow out the glass from the doors. That just enhances the transmittal of noise. And that's your big plan to avoid concealment, to shoot the guns off in this house? And I think there's been another one of these adversarial distortions here. The point is not that by firing the guns off, the point is not only that the neighbors will hear it and pick up the phone and call the police who are only a mile away. I mean, that's a large point as to why you would not plan that. But the point is also that somebody might go to their window and look out and see you leaving. You don't make noise because you don't want to attract attention. It's not just that you don't want to inspire people to call the cops. You don't want them to look. You don't want to attract attention in any way. So just the very fact that the whole purpose of a plan to avoid detection seems to be completely undermined when you buy these shotguns should tell you, therefore, that using the shotguns that Sunday night was not part of a plan to kill the parents and avoid detection. Now, also the fact, and Dr. Burgess testified about this too, the fact that if for whatever crazy reason, and I think through questioning, one of the prosecutors actually suggested in the question that you use a shotgun because you want everybody to hear you, because then you can set up an alibi. Yeah, if you get out the front door without being seen by everybody in the world, maybe you could set up an alibi, but that's another one of those Alice in Wonderland moments in the trial. Okay, but the point is, if you really are going to plan for whatever reason to use a shotgun, and this is something you're thinking about, then you're not going to use it in such a way that you then have to worry about hanging around later to pick up shells. I mean, the purpose of picking up shells from a shotgun, when you intend to dump the gun anyway, is to not leave fingerprints on the base of the shell casing. And you're going to have in evidence that shell that Detective Van Horn emptied here, so you can see what one of those look like, taking the gunpowder out so it's not dangerous. So it's got the birdshot, and it's got the metal base on the bottom of the shotgun shell. And yes, as you saw when I was loading the gun, you generally push the shell in with your thumb, and you can therefore leave a thumbprint. But if you're thinking things through, as the prosecution would have you believe, you wear a glove, and then you don't have to hang around while the neighbors look or call the police or both to pick up the shells. And the fact that they picked up the shells, that there were potential prints on the shells, is evidence of no plan. Now, the other thing that, to me, and I don't believe that Dr. Burgess addressed this, is evidence that there is not this plan. Let me say one thing about this notion about why this was done, to be free of the parent control. This sounds very nice, but what does it mean? It means you got to hate these people bad enough. Don't tell me you're going to kill parents you love to be free of their control. You have to hate them a lot to kill them to be free of their control, rather than free yourself some other way, okay? And if that's how you feel, and if you are planning this thing, one would think that you would load these guns to the hilt. Now, the prosecution they argue that the guns are fully loaded, and that's why there had to be a reload, but the physical evidence is completely contrary to that. Detective Van Horn testified to the number of waddings that were given to him by the Beverly Hills Police Department. And we will assume, since no one wanted to prove otherwise, that the Beverly Hills Police Department wasn't holding out on Detective Van Horn. They gave him everything. And the coroner's office had some waddings in their possession because they were included inside the wounds. So he had all the waddings, and what he testified to is there is only physical evidence of 8 rounds being fired. And 6 of them are buckshot, and 2 of them were birdshot, and the 2 birdshot wounds was the left cheek of Mrs. Menendez. We know this from the coroner, not from Detective Van Horn, and the left shoulder, neck, and ear of Mrs. Menendez. So that's all they can prove by way of evidence of how many rounds were fired, unless they now want to assert that these defendants, the great planners of the Western world, hung around long enough to now start picking up these little teeny bits of buckshot wadding, which is no more than you'll see it, it's just a little plastic disc, which is called an over-powder wad. For the buckshot, there's just a little teeny plastic disc, and now they're going to go hunting around in that room, these people who supposedly plan not to be detected and not caught, looking for these little waddings. So there's no evidence that they did, and it was never mentioned. I mean, Erik did talk about to Oziel the fact that they picked up the shell casings, but there's no mention of these waddings being picked up, and so there's really no evidence that more than 8 rounds were fired. Erik said he loaded his gun with 5, he thinks, and maybe he did. Lyle didn't remember how many he loaded his gun with. But the point of all this is that they did not load what they could have, which is 6 rounds per gun. There is no evidence that 12 and 1, 13 rounds were fired. Because if they had loaded fully 6 each gun, then there was the reload where 1 more round was loaded by Lyle, and Lyle shot his mother with it. And there just isn't any evidence of those 13 rounds. So in a way, the fact that they didn't fully load the guns tells you that this isn't really a plan. These are people acting in a panic who are grabbing shells and loading quickly and running in the house because of the fear that they have that they're about to be attacked. The other thing that indicates that there's, and this is again just circumstantial evidence liable for 2 inferences. If they're both reasonable, the law requires you to find the inference that points towards innocence. And it's just a chain. No one thing here tells you innocent or guilty. The other thing, though, that tells you that there was no real plan here of any kind is that there was no disposal plan that made any sense that was worked out in advance. For one thing, contrary to what Mr. Kuriyama tells you, testimony in this case, both the statement of Dr. Oziel and the statement of Erik, is not that he buried these guns. What he did was he slid them under some bushes down the side of a hill. And he testified he did not go down as far as Dr. Oziel claims. He just went down the hillside, put the guns down, brushed a little dirt and bushes, he said some kind of branches over it, and ran back up the hill. And Mr. Kuriyama has tried to suggest over and over again, as if this was a strangulation case, that Erik was a strong, aggressive athlete. I don't know what his strength has to do with anything. It doesn't take many to load a shotgun, and it takes very little to pull the trigger. I think it's just to make him seem like a big, nasty, aggressive person as compared to his little teeny-weeny parents. But the one place where the fact that Erik is a talented athlete makes some sense is his ability to get up and down a hill rather quickly. I mean, I think I've seen the place where the guns were dropped. I don't know. I'm going on the same testimony that Detective Zoller heard and the same thing that Detective Zoller told me. And as I questioned Detective Zoller about it, this location, it's a location from which the guns could very easily have disappeared afterwards because of this drainage culvert that runs down the side of the hill. But it also is because there's a drainage culvert running down the side of the hill. It isn't like you're working your way through a thicket in the jungle. You can get up and get down that hill rather quickly. But the point is, there's no plan here for what they're going to do with the guns. I mean, how do you know somebody's not going to come by when you're up on Mulholland doing this stuff and seeing you? If you're really thinking in advance, you're going to work something better than that out. Moreover, there's the fact that having not realized that you're going to get fingerprints on the casings because they're not thinking in terms of avoiding detection when they're actually doing the shooting, they're thinking in terms of saving their lives. Nevertheless, had this been planned, you would think that they wouldn't be leaving some of the shells in the back of the car. And had they been the kind of people who could have cold-bloodedly killed their parents, they would not have been so disorganized, disoriented, and discombobulated after this as to have called the police with the car parked in front with shells and other evidence of their purchase of ammunition and shotguns still in it. I know that it's the prosecution's theory that at least Lyle Menendez wasn't truly upset afterwards and wasn't really distraught afterwards, but the very fact that that evidence was left there tells you that neither one of them was thinking rationally afterwards, because neither one of them was the kind of person who could do a thing like this based on some coldly formed plan. The other reason why there's no evidence here of a plan is because they had no alibi. They didn't even have the appearance of an alibi. If they really had planned in advance rather than grabbed for some idea afterward, that they would say they were at the movie theater, they would have movie tickets to prove it. They're easy to get. They give them to you. You give them the money, you get the ticket. You keep the stub, you show it to the police, you had established some kind of alibi. Now, a movie is a very lame alibi anyway because you can always leave. They don't lock you into theaters. And so it's not a very good alibi anyhow. But at least you've got a ticket. And this is supposed to be planned. Now, I know what Mr. Kuriyama's argument is going to be on this, and It's, again, they don't want to deal with the evidence. They don't want to deal with all that defense evidence we put on. They don't want to deal with their own evidence. They would rather invite you to speculate because the evidence doesn't get them where they want to go. And I know what he's going to say. He's going to say, Erik put the ticket in the pocket of his pants, and when he threw the pants away at the gas station, he forgot he had the ticket in the pocket of the pants. Now, if he doesn't say that, he'll only not say that because I've ridiculed him for it right now, because he definitely asked that question of Erik Menendez in his cross-examination. And it's ridiculous. These are your cold, calculating planners. This is their alibi ticket. This is so important. You're going to forget them in the pocket of your pants. It's just guesswork. It's just guesswork to convict somebody of first-degree murder. Well, we can laugh about it, but it's sort of sickening. So there are no tickets in this well-worked-out plan. Just speculation about tickets. Moreover, the whole business with Perry Berman, the idea of having an alibi so there is a human being who can say to the authorities why he couldn't have been there doing that because he was here with me doing this. That's the purpose of an alibi witness. Now, how in the world are you creating Perry Berman as an alibi witness when you tell him you're going to meet him at 9:30, you shoot your parents at 10, and you don't meet him? You tell him you're going to, and you don't meet him at 9:30. You don't even get there at 10:15. You don't get to where you're supposed to meet your alibi witness till 11:07. And what you have therefore done is exactly what happened in this case. You have created a witness for the prosecution who can definitely say you were not with him at the time of the crime. You have created an anti-witness, an anti-alibi witness, the opposite of what you would do if you were planning to create an alibi. So it is perfectly clear, I would think, that the Perry Berman arrangements that Lyle made was not an effort to create an alibi, but purely a social plan. Now, after the shooting, when Erik and Lyle are running around in the car trying to figure out what to do, that's when they decide, we'll say we were at the movies, and we'll say that we then went to the Taste of LA to meet Perry Berman, and we'll claim we got there much earlier than we got there. But we didn't see Perry. That's when the first idea occurs to them to try to use the fact that they had a social plan with Perry Berman as an alibi. But they're not thinking very clearly because obviously the police are going to go to Perry Berman and he's going to say they didn't meet me when they were supposed to meet me, and that's about as big a red flag as the police should need. And they had that red flag and they didn't do anything with it, which is the ultimate amazement. Your Honor, this is a good place for me.
Okay. It's 4:30 and we'll resume tomorrow at 9 o'clock.
Sorry, I paused myself or muted myself. Don't go anywhere. We're going to go right to the next day. So here we go.
Gentlemen, I carried this pen with the notion that I would check off my argument points, and when I went back over my little sheets yesterday, I realized I had checked off very few. So I hope you will bear with me. This has been a 5-month-long trial, and there's been a tremendous amount of evidence, and this is the type of case where so much of what the prosecution is relying on is circumstantial evidence that you can make points about thousands of different facts. Now, I don't intend to comment on every piece of evidence, and I will confess to you I have not even had time in the last week when you were off and I was off part of the time to reread all the evidence. That would be impossible. But what I'm expecting will happen is that when you're deliberating on this case and you're going through your notebooks, you will see things that you wrote down from witnesses that I may not talk very much about. And that may stimulate the conversation between all of you. And if you need to hear that testimony read back, it will be. It's been my experience in jury trials that no matter what the lawyers comment on, the 12 minds of the jurors think of more things and think of points of view on the evidence that has never occurred to us and ultimately decide the case based on their own rational faculties and not on ours. So what I'm trying to do here is point out how so much of this evidence is subject to two interpretations, but also to make sure that you understand what it is the defense in this case was attempting to do. So let me put it in the negative and tell you what we are not attempting to do, what we do not believe is the proper way to approach this case. We were not attempting to show you that Jose and Mary Louise Menendez were such bad people that they should have been shot. That's not the point. That's not what the law would allow, and it isn't what happened here. And when I start talking a little later on about what Erik Menendez was like, what kind of person he was, what kind of personality and character he had, I hope to convince you that he simply was not the kind of person or in the kind of situation on August 20th, 1989, when he could have acted out of revenge, even if it had been appropriate. Now, what's so important that you understand this, what's so important about your understanding this, is that as I go through some of the evidence we presented in order to paint a picture of what the family was like for the children, I want you to keep in mind that I'm not just trying to blacken these people. And the reason for that is if what you come away with is the notion of, oh, they were bad people, now let me see if they deserve to die, you will never understand, never, why Kitty Menendez was killed. If you think of this in terms of payback, that will never make any sense to you. Because although she was a highly abusive mother, there's no way to evaluate what happened to her in terms of paying her back. Our point, and we have tried to make it both through the testimony of Erik Menendez, the testimony of Lyle Menendez, the testimony of expert witnesses, and the testimony of the family members, is that this was a family environment that was run by fear. This was a home run by power. And this was a home in which the children of the family became so fearful, and where fear became the only emotion they were entitled to have, that when a crisis occurred in this family, fear is what guided them. And what we attempted to do, and what I'm hoping to tell you today we succeeded in doing, was to show why Mary Louise Menendez was such an object of fear to her children. Because there has been no evidence, and there could be no evidence, that Erik hated his mother. or that Erik was vengeful towards his mother, or wanted to pay her back. But there is a wealth of evidence that he was afraid of her, and that he had good reason to be afraid of her, that it was reasonable in the context of this family to be afraid of her. I think it's easy for anyone who's heard the evidence in this case to understand why Jose Menendez was a scary person. He wanted to be a scary person. He liked having power, and he liked controlling people through power. He enjoyed it. But it is harder to understand how Mary Louise Menendez was a scary person. She was scary to a number of people, but most scary to her children. Before I start an analysis of the evidence which paints the picture of this family, I want to finish up with a few things that I talked about yesterday. It is very hard to talk about this case in neat little compartments because all of the evidence spills into all of the other evidence. So I think I was sort of scattered yesterday, and I'd like to finish a few things up if I can. One of the things I talked to you about yesterday that's a matter of great concern to me is that you not judge Erik as by comparing him to Lyle or by using things about Lyle against him. Clearly that would not be fair. And it certainly wouldn't be fair in the context of this family where he was always held up unfavorably in comparison with his brother. But I wanted to simply relate to you certain things that have happened here where Erik is basically taking the rap for Lyle. I talked about the childhood and in the incidents of that childhood where that occurred. And then there was testimony in this case that in Kalamazoo in August of 1989, actually in Downers Grove, where Brian Anderson lived, Mrs. Menendez got angry at Erik because Lyle had bought a camcorder and went off on him and was in that posture that we know about. This is her own brother who came here theoretically to balance the picture of Mary Louise Menendez. And if you remember his testimony, he really didn't say a single positive thing about his sister. He loves her, and that's admirable. But he didn't say a single thing about her personality or her character or her parenting style that was inconsistent with what everybody else said. And in fact, this particular story, I thought, was extremely significant because it revealed the repetition of a pattern of behavior from Erik's childhood. And that is, his mother would blame him for things that other people did. And most specifically, she would blame him and make him take punishment for things she had done wrong, for getting his tennis rackets, getting him late to a match. She knew Jose would be extremely angry, and she didn't want that anger on her. If he's going to take out his sadistic anger on someone, let it be the kids. And that was pretty much her ruling attitude throughout the children's childhood. And here it is, her own brother coming in and testifying to the same kind of episode where she goes off. Remember, this is a point when Erik has already determined he's left this camcorder that Lyle bought in New York with Mark Heffernan that summer. He left it by mistake in the overhead compartment of the airplane when he came back from tennis camp in Florida. But he's already called about it. He was very responsible, in fact, about trying to find it. He had all these phone calls, and he determined that baggage claim had the camcorder. And he's arranged to go back to the airport and pick it up. And he's willing to go by himself in the rented car, but she won't let him go alone. These kids can't do anything without the parent controlling and guiding and directing it. So she insists on going back with him. Fine, but first she has to chew him out about it when the only thing he did wrong was forget it. But he tracked it down and he's going to get it. And yet he is yelled at. She is upset with him because Lyle bought a camcorder. Now, there's also been this painting with this broad brush that Erik was rude to his mother or had a bad relationship with his mother, but there's no evidence of that. In fact, the only testimony you've heard where people characterize his relationship with his mother was that he was nice to her, he felt sorry for her, he was worried about her, he was considerate about her. He was not the one who was having these rude confrontations with her that someone like, for example, Ed Fenno or Carlos Baralt talked about were typical with Lyle. But Lyle had a different history with his mother than Erik did. Carlos Baralt testifies that in the summer of 1989, he has these conversations with Jose Menendez. And he testifies that Jose is disgusted with his children. And then when he is pressed by Mr. Curiano to explain exactly what it was Jose Menendez said the boys had been doing, all that was said were things about Lyle. Lyle was having problems at Princeton. Lyle was on disciplinary probation. Lyle had wound up with some flags from an eating club. And when pressed, well, what was it he complained about Erik? Oh, well, Erik had the bad taste to have been attacked by a gang at Calabasas High School. This is the year before, mind you. And they were worried that these gang members had wanted revenge. I mean, that's how Erik was criticized, for being a victim. And yet when pressed again, well, what was he saying was his reason for wanting, in 1989, to disinherit Erik? What was the answer? Well, he was going to disinherit Lyle, so of course he had to disinherit Erik. I mean, Erik's got to take the rap if Lyle's in trouble. And that's what Carlos Baralt testified to. Now, with respect to analyzing the shooting in this case, I don't want Erik to be taking the rap for Lyle. The evidence in this case does not prove that Erik killed anybody. And the evidence in this case does not prove circumstantially, because there's no direct evidence in this case whatsoever of intent to kill. That is all circumstantial evidence. And it's based on the obvious circumstance, if you will, that you go into a room with loaded shotguns and you shoot at people. And that was the testimony that Erik gave, that he walked in the room, he shot straight ahead, but obviously, he admits, he in fact offers the evidence, he's shooting at his parents. And that is circumstantial evidence that you can analyze with respect to intent to kill. But when I get down to here, and I'm talking about the law, I will explain to you why, based on what we now know about fear and the biology of fear, that does not necessarily mean there was, in fact, an intent to kill. And if there is another reasonable interpretation that points away from intent to kill, you will be instructed that when you're analyzing circumstantial evidence with respect to mental state, which is intent to kill, you have to do the same balancing and weighing process as with all the other circumstantial evidence. If there are two reasonable interpretations, you have to accept the one that favors the defense because of the burden of proof. Now, Lyle testified that he is the person who administered the fatal wound to Jose Menendez, and Jose Menendez only had one fatal wound, and that was to the back of his head. The rest of the wounds on him were non-fatal, and he would have survived them. He also testifies that he administered the contact wound to the head of Mary Louise Menendez, and that was an instantly fatal wound. Now, she had received other wounds that were potentially fatal, but they could not be said to have been as rapidly fatal as the one that was administered to her face. And there's no evidence as to who administered the other potentially fatal wounds to her. She had a lot of wounds and a lot of injuries, and the prosecution has tried to mislead you into believing that every wound means a round of shotgun shell fired. And the coroner was very clear that that's not the case, that you can have a number of wounds all from one round of a shotgun shell, particularly when you're talking about buckshot of the size involved here that has 27 pellets to a shell. And there isn't a single wound on either one of them that has 27 pellets. The one wound we don't know about is the wound to Jose Menendez's head. There wasn't even testimony that all 27 pellets were recovered from that wound, and it was described as a contact wound. But my point is, if you go back to the testimony of the coroner, you will understand that if you shoot one shell in the direction of two people from a distance, and everything was a distance shot except the two head wounds I've just described, if you shoot that, they spread. And so you can hit two people at once, or you can hit one person and that deflects part of the round of 27 pellets, and they go off and hit another person. There is, in fact, in this case, in analyzing this crime scene, absolutely no way anybody or any expert could have told you exactly how many rounds were fired. Had there been such a way, one side or the other, believe me, would have called an expert to explain it. But it is such a disorganized and confused crime scene, and there is so much evidence pointing in different directions, if you will, that it cannot be reconstructed for you that way. Now, later on, when I'm talking about the actual events of those last few days, I'm going to talk more about where some of the wounds are and what their significance is with respect to confirming the testimony that Erik gave about what he and his brother were doing. But for now, I just want to make it clear that there is no evidence in this case that Erik killed anybody. And just the last piece, and this is the post-shooting activity, is this emphasis that the prosecution has had throughout the case on the purchase of the Rolex watches. Yes, it's bad taste to spend money when you've killed your parents. But again, it's one of those situations that are so typical in the life of the Menendez brothers. Erik goes off to buy a jacket so that he can attend the memorial service. His brother goes into the jewelry store and starts this mad spending spree with Rolexes and money clips. The woman who sold the jewelry said only one of them did the talking, and that was the one who made the phone call to their Uncle Carlos, and that was Lyle. But Erik admits, and he didn't have to, I suppose, that he received one of those watches, one of the stainless steel ones, and he proceeded to lose it. Now, if you want to believe that he killed his parents so that he could get a stainless steel Rolex watch, I cannot stop you. And now just turning once again briefly to the testimony and the tape with regard to Dr. Oziel. With regard to Dr. Oziel, there are probably 150 things that could be said about his testimony, and I'll let you all say them to each other. But with respect to the tape, and I do think you have to thrash the deck. You cannot just ignore whole bunches of the evidence. You do have to work it through and make a decision about whether it's worthy of belief before you simply dismiss it. And that's just a matter of respect for all the work we've done, frankly. And the prosecution's worked hard, and we've worked hard, and Dr. Oziel took up over a month of this trial, if you look at the whole everything that had to do with him. So I think you've got to pay some attention to him, but not be fooled. What I put on this particular board is the proof that Dr. Oziel lied to you about what was said to him on October 31st and November 2nd. And lied to you about the bad stuff. And what I've done on the left is what he testified occurred in those sessions. And then on the right, whether the tape confirms or does not confirm that testimony. And on October 31st, he started out, and I can do this with my little copy so I don't block you. He started out saying that Erik came to him tearful and remorseful and sad and suicidal and all the rest of it. And apparently he was telling the truth about how Erik was feeling, because Erik sounds exactly the same and is saying the same things on the tape. On October 31st and November 2nd, he claims Erik expressed hatred for his father. On the tape, you can hear Erik talking only about how he loves his parents and regrets what he's done and wishes he could undo it. On October 31st and November 2nd, Dr. Oziel claims that Erik said his father was controlling and domineering and blah, blah, blah. On the tape, although Oziel keeps suggesting that, 13 times in one speech, but not just in that one speech, neither Erik nor Lyle even ever say, yes, my father was controlling and we hated him and we had to stop it. On October 31st and November 2nd, Dr. Oziel says there was a discussion about the mother was such a pitiful mess that she was killed because she didn't want to live anyway. And both Erik and Lyle testified that, yes, that was a suggestion of Dr. Oziel's, and they signed on to it because they felt so guilty, that it made them feel slightly better to think that their mother wouldn't have wanted to live anyway. And on the tape, Dr. Oziel discusses that, and Erik agrees with him. He also testified that on October 31st and November 2nd, there was, or it may have been just November 2nd, that there was discussion about killing their mother because she would have been a witness. I find that the most offensive of all of Dr. Oziel's lies, and obviously there's absolutely nothing about that on the tape. Then he talks about the fact that both Erik and Lyle at different times on either the 31st or the 2nd, it's not real clear, talk about how this murder was the perfect plan and the perfect murder, and there's nothing like that on the tape. And the next line is facts of killing. Now, one thing I will say about Julon Smith's testimony, she says that now she understands, because she's gotten better and she's out from under Oziel's clutches, that he told her stories about what the Menendez brothers had told him. And some of the things he told her were some of the actual things that the Menendez brothers had told him, and others were gruesome and gory and elaborate things that he made up, I believe, to terrorize and control her, and also because he has a very sick interest in the goriness of all of this. You don't usually go to a therapist to have him grill you on all the gruesome details of something like this. You go to him to help you. And in this case, for example, Erik went to Dr. Oziel because he wanted to kill himself. He had been his patient for a year, and at no time during any of these sessions do you know about did Dr. Oziel even approach trying to treat Erik for his suicide thoughts, for his depression. He obviously didn't care if the kid killed himself. He just wanted to make sure he knew all the gory details so he could then be in a position of power to do what we know he did with many other people: manipulate, control, and dominate. So when he sits there at these sessions talking about Jose Menendez as a manipulator and a controller and a dominator, you wonder if he's looking in a mirror, because he is precisely the same type of person that Jose Menendez has been characterized to you as. And we know that not just because he uses those words, but because Julian Smith told you how he deals with people. And with respect to what she heard and what she didn't heard, one of the things that she testified to is that he told her that all the fact when he was bragging about how he'd gotten them on tape and now he had what he wanted, and she believed that that meant his protection, and we believe that meant his blackmail device. But he told her that all the facts of the killing were on this tape, that he had gotten them to incriminate themselves, and of course, none of them are. This is not a discussion at all about the facts of the killing. This is a discussion about what he wants, which is to have the core of November 2nd, when Lyle was talking, repeated. Remember, Lyle would never talk to Dr. Oziel about the details. So if he wants to get Lyle on tape, the only thing he's going to be able to get him on tape about is talking about the family. And we know that the brothers were not prepared to talk about the real secrets of this family, and so they talked about Dr. Oziel's preconceived notion of what had gone on here. Now keep in mind, when we talk about this, you might say to yourself, "How? Yeah, right. Why would Oziel have a preconceived notion? How could Oziel have a preconceived notion?" But remember, Dr. Oziel was seeing this family for a year. And he testified that he had formed opinions of Jose Menendez and Mary Louise Menendez. He had met with these people. You have the appointment records that have been condensed for you to protect, as he never does, the confidentiality of his other patients. You're going to get these calendars rather than his actual appointment books, which show you how many patients he saw in a given day and when he was seeing the Menendez family. And you'll have the billing records that will show how many times he met with the parents. So he met these people, and in his usual self-important way, he formed opinions about them. And so we are perfectly within our rights and within reason to argue that he could start out any conversation with the Menendez brothers, whether on October 31st or November 2nd, with his own set idea of what the parents were like and what the family dynamic was like, and therefore what the reasons for this were, without them ever saying a word, because he is just so smart-faced a person as to come up with his little pet theories up front. One other thing I will say about Dr. Oziel, and then I shall leave him, hopefully for all time, and that is this. One of the things we tell jurors to evaluate when they're evaluating the credibility of a witness is their demeanor on the witness stand. And to some extent, you can look at demeanor and learn something about someone. But to a large extent, that's very, very difficult to do in a case like this. And I say that because I don't know if you felt it or not, but this case was tense. I mean, from day one, it was hard fought. It's a small courtroom. It's been very cold in here. It's been tense. And it's been nerve-wracking. And it was that way for virtually every witness. And to try to evaluate a witness on the witness stand in a case like this, when they're not just nervous, I mean, people on the witness stand in this case were frightened to death. The family members were, and Erik clearly was. But there was one cool cucumber, one unflappable person, so sure of his own rectitude, and that was Dr. Oziel, the only unnervous witness in the whole trial. Now, ordinarily, when you're analyzing someone, you say to yourself, well, if they're nervous, maybe they're truthful. I think the fact that that man sat here in a death penalty trial of two people who came to him. Erik was 17 years old when he was referred to Dr. Oziel. Still a kid, even by Mr. Kuriyama's definition of adulthood. He came to him then, he sits in this courtroom, here is his former patient, a person he is described as tearful and depressed and suicidal. Therapists are supposed to care about their patients. They don't have to love them, but they are supposed to care. That's their commitment. They're healers. They're supposed to be in the health-providing profession. And he sits here absolutely unremorseful about the hideous thing that he did in betraying their confidentiality. Not hideous because they got arrested, because frankly, Erik had to be arrested. He was going to kill himself if he wasn't. There's no way he could have survived without having this brought to a halt, without having these issues finally dealt with, without having to finally reveal the secret so that he could stop lying and being false in his life. Because there was testimony, and I think it's well known, that when a child is keeping a secret, it encourages them to be false and to lie because they can't be their real self. And the lying stops once you reveal the secret. Once it's out and you see that people don't shun you and don't run from you, then you can be truthful about yourself and you can be truthful about your life. But until he was arrested, that wasn't going to happen. And he had to be arrested. And if you recall the testimony of Dr. Vickery, jail was a vacation compared to what his home life had been. Jail felt like freedom compared to what his home life. Jail in a one-man cell in the scariest part of the jail, the high-power unit, where all the
Can you imagine when they do get out? Because I do believe they're going to get out, possibly before the holidays, hopefully. That is the hope for the family. That is the goal for their attorney, Mark Garagos, and the DA, I believe, who's fully on board, who has written a letter to the governor saying, let's, what's the word? Vacate, I don't know, vacate their sentencing. He wants them resentenced. He wants their charges lessened to manslaughter, which means they would have been out like 25 years ago. So, if they do get their charges lessened by the governor, because I believe it's the governor is the only one that can do it, then they will probably be released immediately. So I don't know, guys. What do you think about them getting out? She's talking about prison was freedom to them. Can you imagine when they're actually out of prison and in the arms of their family members and loved ones? And the boys are both married now. I think some of them have kids. I don't even know how that's possible, but we'll get into that because after we finish all of this, we'll kind of go over like what's going on now, and we'll go over the whatchamacallit, the brief for the Supreme Court to try to overturn their or not overturn, but to introduce new evidence because it wasn't introduced at trial. We didn't have the confession or admission rather from Roy Rossello from Menudo, who came forward and claimed that Jose essayed him in the Hollywood or in their Beverly Hills home when he was younger. Obviously, he was a minor then in the band Menudo, who Jose managed at RCA Records. And then the other piece of evidence, the new piece of evidence that they want the Supreme Court to look at is the letter that Erik sent from, I think he was at camp or something. He sent it to Andy, his cousin Andy Cano, who is no longer with us. He passed away, which is sad because him and Erik were like really great friends. So unfortunately, when Erik gets out, he's not going to have Andy. So he lost out on all that time with Andy. And I don't know what happened to Andy, but I think it may even have to do like he was depressed and never really recovered from what happened to his cousins. I don't know what happened to Andy. If anybody does know, maybe I'll do a where is he now? You know how what happened to him, and maybe deep dive into his death. I don't know if he did it himself, if he had depression issues. I'm not really sure, but I'll look into that and see what happened with Andy. But that's the other piece of evidence that the brothers want to admit because once Andy passed away, a family member found this letter that Andy had in his belongings, and that is how it got brought out again. So it was found after Andy passed away, and they want that evaluated. Erik talks about the things that were happening, and he was saying it's still happening. Andy, my father coming in at night, I'm so scared, can't stand to look at him, and that's about like as much detail as he gets into, but um, it's obvious what he's talking about. So and that letter was written several months before the homicides even occurred. So there is proof that these things happened and the things that the boys are talking about happened. And they're not just making it up. They're not acting. You can't act that way. That's ridiculous. You can't, if you want to, okay, if you want to say that the boys were acting, look at their testimony on the stand versus Amber Heard's testimony on the stand for Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard, and you can tell she's faking. She's got the crocodile tears. She's so over the top dramatic. That's acting. What these boys were doing, I think, was probably the realest and most honest they've been about the family situation ever because they've never wanted to talk about it. So I really think, like, on the stand, that's all true emotion, raw feelings that these boys still have to deal with today because that's never going to go away. The things that happen in their lives, that shapes them. Everything that they did from the moment they were born with their family up until those crimes shaped them into the men that they are. And they're actually really good men in prison. And we went over that in I went over the memorandum to in support of vacating their sentence or whatever it was. We went over that, and they both have put forth these programs and they're helping others who have suffered from maltreatment in prison. So they've really they've become really good, upstanding inmates. So I think I said this before, they're good, upstanding inmates. So I believe fully that once they're out, which I think they're going to be, they can be upstanding citizens here. I mean, Jose was a piece of trash. I'm going to say that. But the one thing that I will say is good about Jose was that he always taught his boys to succeed. Maybe not in the best ways, but that has always made them strive to do more and be better. And that's what I think they're doing in prison and using that drive for success to be successful in whatever it is that they're trying to do in their lives. And now their lives have become dedicated to helping others. So I just wanted to throw that in there. But my whole point was, if it was such a shock going into prison and that was your freedom from this abusive home, imagine what it's going to be like when they finally do come and get out of prison, which fingers crossed we hope is soon.
Truly dangerous people are, was a better environment for this young man than what his home life had been. But back to Dr. Oziel. He sits here having nevertheless brought his patient into a situation where he's facing death, and he doesn't have the slightest pang of conscience. And we know that he lied about why he told Julian Smith. He did it to titillate and to manipulate. He's got these weird relationships with women, his wife included. I mean, he brings the mistresses into the home. It's very bizarre. But he didn't miss a beat. Nothing flapped him. Well, Mrs. Abramson, you know full well. Arrogant, conscienceless man.
Very.
And the last thing that the tape demonstrates, the last two things, is he testifies that Erik had told him that he knew he was out of the will, he knew he was disinherited on November 2nd, October 31st, and the same thing is true on the tape. And he also testifies that they talked with some elaboration about a plan that Erik did, but Erik never talks about a plan on the tape. He talks about having no choice. Okay, the other thing I wanted to go back to yesterday about briefly, I think I'll save that for later. Excuse me. Okay, is with talking about the circumstantial evidence of whether or not there was a plan by analyzing the crime scene. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Dr. Burgess used a term that I was not familiar with when she testified, and that term was staging. If someone has a pre-existing plan to get away with something, which is what plan is for, they would try to make it look like what happened for different reasons than their reasons, to shift blame. And the obvious thing that would have been done here, if the Menendez brothers had planned to kill their parents, was that they would have tried to make it look like a stranger did it. Here is a shooting in a home, in a wealthy neighborhood, and at a home where the burglar alarm system is never put on, and lots of people know that. And it's at a home where doors are ordinarily left unlocked until very late in the evening. I don't know if you recall the testimony, but the brothers never had their own keys to this house. It was their parents' house and not theirs, like everything else in that family. And Ed Fenno, who lived there, testified that they didn't have keys and that doors were left unlocked almost all the time. So it would have been particularly easy for this home to stage a burglary. You don't have to break windows or use pry marks because this is a home where people who visit it know that doors are left open. So how do you stage a burglary? Take a few things. In fact, if you really were planning to kill your parents and you know they're in the den, as the prosecution argues, watching television, and you're lying in wait and you're watching and waiting for your opportune moment, you got plenty of time to go up to mom's room and steal the jewels or the mink coat or some of the electronic equipment and take it out to the back so that when you're driving away later, ready to dump the guns, which are also supposedly part of your plan, you dump the stuff. But you certainly do not go to the police department that morning and tell them absolutely nothing's missing. It couldn't have been a burglary. Now, anybody, I realize perhaps more even than you do how limited the experiences of the Menendez brothers were growing up, how little experience they had of other people and other people's lives. But even they, exposed as we all are to popular culture, know that the mafia does not use shotguns, thus bringing down all the attention of the neighborhood. Anybody, right, who's ever seen a mafia movie knows that it's the bullet in the back of the head, it's the silencer. Professional killers are the greatest planners of all. They want to get away with it. They do not use shotguns. So you're not going to suggest.
And in any movie I've seen with mafia, they usually take their victims somewhere else and do it, right? And then they get rid of the body, like usually where they did it. I don't know. That's just mafia movies that I've seen, but usually they don't just do it in the home. Sometimes, maybe, but not always.
And in fact, Lyle did not suggest on August 21st that the mafia did it. The obvious staging, the obvious shifting of blame was to simply say something's missing. I mean, this is the house with the boxes everywhere. This is not the Calabasas house where boxes take up the living room, but this is in the dressing rooms of Jose and Kitty Menendez. There are unpacked boxes. The house is a mess. Yes, Erik's room is a mess. He's guilty because he's a teenager and his room is a mess. But the fact of the matter is, there's a mess in this house. And although the police claim now there was no evidence of ransacking, the brothers could have created evidence of ransacking if, as the prosecution contends, this was all calculated and they had time afterwards to do whatever they wanted to do. But the fact is that that is the single most obvious lack of plan in the entire crime scene analysis. Not only did Lyle, by the way, say, oh no, this wasn't a burglary, he also said, oh no, well, my brother had some problem with a gang a year ago, but no, I don't think it was that either. He also says, I don't really think it was his business, my dad was too clean, on and on. Now, that doesn't show much planning at all. With respect to the little story they came up with for the police, that doesn't show planning or a well-thought-out story either. I mean, the fact of the matter is, this was, as Dr. Burgess said, a typical family violence, panic, fear, disorganized shooting where the shooters got lucky. And you can never plan your luck in life. They got lucky because the Beverly Hills Police Department dropped the ball that night. And they knew it soon after. Soon after, they're watching the brothers. But that night, they blew it. And they blew it because I don't think they could understand, and it's clear the prosecution refuses to this day to understand how kids could kill their parents and love them and feel horrible about it and cry and be traumatized right after the event. I don't think they want to believe it, and they certainly didn't understand it that night, because all it took for Erik to be in jail that night was for someone to put a little piece of wax on his hands and the gunshot residue would have been there, or to search their car before 8:30 the next morning when it's sitting there in police custody, and they didn't do that, or to follow up with questions, how could you have smelled smoke, young man, if you're not there till 11:45? And then the person who starts crying in the middle of the interview, who Sergeant Edmonds says lost it, was incoherent, we couldn't go on, he would have told you when he smelled smoke. Now, that doesn't make them responsible for the killing, obviously not. But we're talking about, is this planned? And I'm telling you, the whole thing, it's an accident that they didn't get arrested. And Erik said to Dr. Oziel that he was amazed that he wasn't arrested. Well, I'll share with you, so was I. Because I read about this case 2 days afterwards, like everybody else did in the LA Times, and I looked at it, and knowing what I know and what I'm willing to understand, I said the boys did it. And so don't tell me the Beverly Hills Police Department, if they wanted to open their eyes and understand a little bit about family violence and child abuse, couldn't have figured it out themselves. But they claim they still don't. I've already told you about the fact that Erik continually drops clues. I don't tell you that in order to say, well, they should have arrested him sooner. I tell you that in order to show what kind of person he was. This is not your cool, calculated planner. This is not your cold, vicious killer. This is not your arrogant, Mr. Kuriyama's word, rich boy. Tell me who came in here and said Erik was arrogant. The only arrogant person you've heard about in this family was Jose Menendez. Now, when you finish analyzing all of this lack of plan evidence, you come back to the essential question that the prosecution does not have an answer for. Mr. Kuriyama tried to suggest some vague notion in his opening, and that question is, why did this happen when it happened? What, if we're telling the truth, if our case is true, if all this abuse happened even, why did this happen when it happened? Even if they're prepared to concede this, that these are bad parents. Bad's not the right word. But even if they say these are bad parents, right, the defense didn't have the greatest life, that's no excuse to kill them. That's not the point. Based on their theory, they can't give you a reason why. All of a sudden, after 18 years, Erik would just say, guess what? Dad's not a nice guy. And I don't like my life, so I shall kill him and walk away from this family and take Mom along for the ride. Now, that's what they say now under theory number 3, the control theory, is what happened. But what precipitated that? And I suggest to you what precipitated when this happened was precisely what we told you, a crisis of monumental importance and significance, that Erik had done the thing he had been threatened with death to do since the time he was a little kid. He told his brother, and the brother confronted his father about the molestation. And only the revelation of the molestation secret makes sense with respect to why this happened then. And there is nothing the prosecution can come up with which would make any rational person think, oh, that's it. That's what knocked this little planet, Erik Menendez, who his whole life was circling these twin stars of his parents, locked in their gravitational field of total control and total intrusion and total indoctrination. What knocks that kid, who is tied by every notion of gravity, psychological and physical and dependency, to these people, so out of course that he can look back and say, my life hasn't been great, I think I'll fix it. That absolutely is impossible. For kids in these families, it is absolutely impossible to think that he wakes up a different person one morning, no longer under the total influence of these people. These people are his world, and he expected them to go on that way. And that was just fine with him, if his father would just free him from this thing he could not tolerate. You talk about him being an adult at 18. He is incredibly immature. He should have had that crisis, frankly, a couple of years before. He is a case of arrested development because they didn't let him develop as an independent person. He's just starting to hit these issues of independence, of having a right to his own body. At 18, that I figured out at 12. I've got a right to my body, Mom, don't hit me. Well, he can't figure that out at 12. When his father rapes it at 12, he can't pick up a hanger and hit him and have a father who will say, you're right, I'm wrong, you're not a baby anymore, I can't treat you like I own you. Not in this family. Not in this family at 18, he's still a baby. Not an itsy-bitsy baby, but mentally and emotionally? When was he allowed to grow up to be an independent thinker, to think that he was strong enough to confront these people, to think that he even had a right to make his own decisions? Abused children do not think, I'm living in an abusive household. They think, I'm sad. What did I do wrong? Why are they treating me this way? I must have done something wrong. They don't know any other life. They don't know other parents don't do this to kids. They don't know they're in an abusive family. They don't know their father's controlling. All they know is, this is life, and I have to cope with it. But at certain developmental ages, the human organism simply needs to be recognized as a separate human being. And for most of us, that happens a whole lot younger than 18. But for Erik, locked in this family, it happens at 18. He can't handle it anymore. And he has been dreaming of rescue for 3 years. He has coped with his incredibly sadistic and violent father. Not all child molesters are sadistic and violent. Some of them are quite meek and mild. Some of them love children. Now, it's very damaging for a child to be molested by anybody, even somebody who is nice. But Jose Menendez stopped being nice when Erik was 11. And he then started to display the same kind of sadism that other people saw in other aspects of his child rearing. The jumping and this sort of thing. He started to display that within the context of the sex. Now that is extreme sexual molestation, extreme abuse. And Erik has managed to cope and has managed to hold on with one hope. I will go to college, and I don't have to confront him because I can't. I'm a coward. He is all in this family. I can't run away because where would I go and who would believe me? And they've made him such a cripple. Mr. Kuriyama says he'd get off his butt and work. Was Mr. Kuriyama on a tennis court at 5 o'clock in the morning when he was 10 years old, drilled and grilled for 3 hours, and then went to school, and then taken around for more tennis courts for more hours of drilling and grilling, and then went back home to have dinner, which was like Jeopardy, and more drilling and grilling, and then had to satisfy his father's perversion, and then had to do his homework till 10 o'clock at night? And he wants to talk about this kid not working? This kid worked every day of his life to please these people. Every single day of his life. This is the hardest working kid I've ever heard of. He should have been paid. They violated the child labor laws, and he has the nerve to sit there. He should get off his butt and work. So they cannot answer for you the question of why this happened when it happened. But we can. And we can answer for you the question of why mom. And it's hard, and I know it, and I've known it since the day I got this case. It's hard to convince people that mommies can be cruel, and that mommies cannot love their children, and that mommies can be frightful to their kids. And we always knew it would be difficult because there's a tendency to be sympathetic to a woman who is married to a bad guy who cheats on her. And there is a tendency to be sympathetic towards a woman who suffered. And I don't doubt Kitty Menendez suffered for herself. I don't doubt for a minute that she was self-absorbed her whole life. And that Jose Menendez and money and big houses and the right zip code were extremely important to her. And I suspect, though we were not able to prove it to you, in spite of trying, that she had a very miserable childhood. And I'm sorry for her for that. But she didn't have a right to take her grief out on her kids, and she did.
They didn't let a lot of that in, especially Dr. Burgess had reviewed all of Kitty's mental health records and medical records and whatnot, and her background and everything. And they had tried to get a lot of that in her background, how she grew up, what kind of maltreatment Kitty underwent when she was growing up, because there was definitely maltreatment in her household and Jose's. So we didn't get to learn all about it because this stupid judge kept it out, which I think is very relevant.
She was an adult when she walked into Jose Menendez, and she had family that she was supposedly, according to her brother Brian, close to, and her sister Joan, close to, family. And she had friends. And yet, she didn't seek to get out of this abusive situation for herself, and she never, ever protected her kids. Now, that would be not nice if that was all she had done. But no, she heaped her own version of torture and torment on her boys, and she admitted it. To her own therapist, she said, I took out my frustration over Jose having to be away and working and traveling on my boys, and I flew into rages, and indeed she did. And even if she felt badly about it in confessional moments, she never told the kids she felt badly about it. She never apologized to her children for putting them through what she put them through all those years. She took it out on them, and all they knew was, Mom doesn't like us. Mom hates us, in fact, as she was so frequent to tell them. Mom will hurt us. And she indeed did. And that's all they know. But she is an adult. And in her misery and her self-pity and her unhappiness, she leaves suicide letters around for her children to find on purpose. She feels so sorry for herself. She doesn't feel sorry for her children, and she doesn't think, what will this do? Here is Erik. They've just moved here from New Jersey. He is all alone. He has no friends. He has no family that he's close to except them. You hear the testimony, for example, of Terry and Carlos. They hardly knew this person. They didn't even get to know Lyle very well until after the parents were dead. They never spent a minute alone with Erik Menendez. Mark kind of told you the same thing. Yes, she saw him at these happy family gatherings in Muncie, and she never spent any time alone with him until after the parents were killed. They had so successfully isolated these kids from relatives who lived 10 minutes away. They had never had any independent relationship with any other grown-up except their parents, because the coaches came and went on Dad's whim. So there was no opportunity for them to have anybody, but she has potential support for her grief and her misery. Okay. I have another one of these. Now, Mr. Kuriyama tried to give you the notion yesterday that this was just a slightly distorted version of Ozzie and Harriet, and these were their disgracefully ungrateful kids. What I have done is I have read every witness who knew Jose Menendez and testified. And I have written on this flip chart every description. So long as 2 people made it, it hit the chart. If it was only his office wife, it didn't hit the chart. And I will explain why Marzi Eisenberg's opinion of him, though no doubt genuinely felt, has nothing whatsoever to do with how he was around his kids. These are the words that the people who knew him, and this is his sisters, who loved him. He was, you know, to give the devil his due, brilliant, charming, some would think, good-looking, clever, funny, yes, at other people's expense, good company so long as he's on your side. Mr. Kuriyama misquoted Carlos Baralt yesterday. He said Carlos Baralt said that Jose Menendez was a good guy to be with. Yes, said Carlos, so long as he's on your side. You wouldn't want to be on the other side of Jose Menendez, said his brother-in-law, who clearly liked him. You know, you can like people in your family without judgment. But even the family uses these adjectives to describe him. And I went back to the earliest testimony, starting with people like Perry Berman. And here's what they say, bear with me, about Jose Menendez. Very strict, sarcastic, ultimate control freak, belittling, ridiculing, humiliating, successful, reserved, private, image conscious. It's not just Mrs. Menendez who's concerned about what the neighbors will think. It is Jose as well. Intimidating, by far the most frequently used word. Intimidating to adults, intimidating to people at work, intimidating to teachers, intimidating to coaches, intimidating to his friends. What do you think he's like to a 2-year-old, or a 5-year-old, or a 9-year-old, or an 18-year-old who has always been under his thumb? He is terrifying to that person. Cruel, clearly cruel. Controlling, intelligent, apparently very intelligent. Angry, strong-willed, very competitive, the understatement of the century. Arrogant, intense. And I want you to see something here. I want to stop at intense for a minute. You remember there was testimony from Dr. Ann Tyler, a witness that Mrs. Bozanich went out of her way to ridicule and humiliate. Sometimes some of these adjectives apply to the way that the prosecution dealt with witnesses, but I don't believe that Mr. Kuriyama or Mrs. Bozanich is half as bad as Mr. and Mrs. Menendez. However, when Dr. Tyler was testifying, she was not even 1/10 as bad. When Dr. Tyler was testifying, she was asked if she had looked over some early family photographs of when the boys were babies, and she said she had. And she was asked if she saw an interesting difference between the photographs of Mrs. Menendez and Erik and the photographs of Mr. Menendez and the boys. And she said she did. The photographs of Mrs. Menendez with Erik has Kitty holding him like a package, just an object, no interaction. She's never looking at him. But the photographs of Mr. Menendez and the children show this intensity. He is locked into these children. Mr. Kuriyama would have you believe it's because he loves them that he's so involved with his kids. I think this guy approaches his children the way a scientist looks at a petri dish, or a guinea pig, or a little laboratory rat. Oh, what fun! A little clay thing that I can shape and mold and bend to my will. And he is fascinated with the prospect of the ultimate power trip. Because as intimidating and as power-mongering and as manipulative as this man is with grown-ups, think of the possibilities when it's just a little kid who will worship you from birth because they do love you without being taught how, and who will do what you say and do because you are so much bigger and stronger and smarter than they are. And the prospect of this little human experiment to create, first with the firstborn, a little Jose, and then with the secondborn, Jose's perfect toy, is just irresistible for this sort of person. And here, unlike any of the pictures that Dr. Tyler saw of Mrs. Menendez, here is Jose Menendez with his little child, this hand slipping off the bar, staring intently to see if the experiment's going to work. Now, is he going to fall and crack his skull so I can say, don't trust Daddy? Or is he going to make it and be a Menendez, fearless and strong at 18 months? And what is so amazing about this picture is where are Papa's arms? So, because if that baby falls, that baby hits the deck. And he knows it. And it's like Marty kind of told you, he had this little experiment with this bar where he used to lift Erik up. And if the kid wasn't strong enough, he was going to have a boo-boo. And Mrs. Cano tried to stop him from doing that because her own child had fallen off the jungle gym and was seriously hurt. And he knew it. He didn't care if his children suffered. He only cared if they turned out to be the little creatures that he wanted to make them, irrespective of who they were or what they wanted or how much it hurt them or how much they suffered or how frightened they were or what the night was like in their life, because he could care less. So yes, he is very intense, and he is very intensely focused on his little laboratory animals. And he is driven, and he is mocking, and he is aggressive and berating and very powerful, and he is oppressive. And that is a word I think that was, no, never mind, I can't remember who used it. And he put people down routinely, and he was very proud of himself, and manipulative, and very possessive. And all serious abusers are very possessive of the object. And one of the reasons is not just the pleasure of being able to be the only scientist who experiments with this particular little animal, but the fact that the animal has got a devastating secret. And if the animal talks, the scientist goes to jail. And so he is very possessive, as relatives testified, of his children because he doesn't want anybody getting close to them, or dad could be in big trouble. He also believes he is the smartest person on earth, superior to everyone else, knows all the answers, and doesn't want anybody messing with his kids' minds. Mr. Kuriyama suggested Jose Menendez was interested in the education of his children. Oh, no, he wasn't. He only wanted them to know his indoctrinations, his brainwashing. They should only believe about the world his cynical view of things. He did not care one whit if Erik learned anything, so long as he got the grade and the credential to get into the school to make the right contacts so he can be the kind of success his father was in business, i.e. bully people and make a lot of money. And that was all he wanted his kids to know. He could care less if Erik knew anything. Why do you do a kid's homework? Because you want him to learn? Why do you drive him and pressure him? Because you want him to learn? Why don't you treat his learning disabilities, which is in his way, and the fact that your wife sits there with a stopwatch with an anxious kid who cannot read well and times him on reading comprehension tests, and when he doesn't get it right, smacks him in the back of the head? Why don't you do something about that if you are really interested in a child who can learn? He is demanding. He is a fun person if he's on your side. He is bright, unquestionably, made fun of people. He is stern. He is obnoxious. He is verbally abusive. He is unfair. He is confrontational, attractive, some say, belligerent, rude, nasty, frightening, charismatic, and I think that is very important. I think it is difficult enough for a child in an abusive home to get any sense of their own identity, to have any hope of ever being able to separate themselves from a parent. But when the parent is, as from a child's perspective, as positive a figure, if you will, as Jose Menendez was, it's 10 times harder. This is not some ugly, stupid, broken down drunk who comes home on Saturday night and beats the wife and the kids and then rolls off to wherever such guys roll, or gals roll off to. This is a charm boy. This is an intense, exciting person. This is a person you heard who, when he walks into a room, all eyes are riveted on him. He can hold any crowd. He and his wife move through parties like movie stars. That's how they're thought of in this family. This is somebody whose love is extremely important. Imagine if this son loved you, you would bask in the glory of that sunlight your whole life. And when Jose Menendez sets the family up in such a way that his love is all important, and if you want it, you better do A, B, C, and D, the kids are hooked. Because he is, the idea of love from this man has got to be, after all, he tells the kids, I'm the greatest, I'm the best, we're the Menendezes, we could rule the world. You know, all you have to do, kid, is fit this pattern, and then you're my boy, you're my son. Now, he doesn't hold that out for as sure a thing for number 2 as he does for number 1, but that is this humongous golden carrot that drives this kid, that strives this little day laborer and night laborer, this hard little worker, to try to please dad. Because dad is something else. He's a piece of work. People admire him. So long as they don't get too close, so that mouth of his and those hands of his don't come down on them. He's an attractive type. He is also relentless. He has a sense of humor, usually at someone else's expense. He is very articulate. He is dominating. He's a strong personality. He controls with a look or a word. I don't know if it's on this chart. I'm going to show you something about looks and words. We talked a lot, and our experts talked a lot about cues. Cues is some fancy way of saying you watch the expression on somebody's face to figure out what they're going to do to you. Cues. And in this family, you heard only that Jose Menendez would silence us, Kitty, or turn to the boy, stop. Lyle, Erik, and everybody freezes. Now, if everybody doesn't freeze right away, he goes to the Tupperware cabinet and throws everything on the floor to get attention. This is a man who behaves in very extreme ways, and so does his wife, and that becomes important later. But he was known for having a look or a word or a gesture that could control the people around him. And that's why when Lyle and Erik are scanning the environment around them, as hyper-vigilant children do, they're looking for the tiniest things. A little word here, a little word there, as Lyle says on the tape to Dr. Oziel. Because these are not people who talk to their children in any way that you and I understand conversation. There is no up and back. There is no give and take. There is no, Erik, what do you think? Erik, what's your opinion of? Erik, what do you want to do? Erik, how do you feel about it? None of that ever goes on. Dad announces and the kids obey. And dad gets displeased and doesn't tell you about it. You have to find out about it through your therapist, who's called by your mother and is told in May of 1989, Jose is really upset. There's this giant rift forming between him and Erik because Erik, this is Kitty telling Oziel, because Erik has not been reporting all of the details of his tennis practice schedule to Jose. This, in this family, is rebellion most severe. And therefore, he's about to be disowned. Now, disowned is not disinherit. Disinherit already happened. Disowned is he ceased to exist. Because he's certainly, as Erik said, he's not going to put him out on the street. Go out there, kid, you with $1 million secret. You with the thing that can put me in prison for the rest of my life. Disowned is died. Disowned as you cease to exist. Disowned as we get rid of you. That's what disowned means to Erik. And from a man who has said, I can get rid of this family and get another one, and never makes it clear that he doesn't mean kill. So, this is the person who can control in these teeny little ways, and this is what his sons look for. And this is what may appear to you to be unreasonable that they seize on these tiny things, such as you don't have to go to that camp. What does it matter anymore? And that's Jose talking to Lyle that Sunday. Hey, what does it matter? Tennis has been our whole life, Dad. You've been telling me you want me to do this camp. You know, that's a continuation of our relationship. Now you're telling me it doesn't matter anymore? It may sound like nothing to you, but with Lyle's special knowledge, it's a big deal. And Roger Smith, who is not related to the Menendez brothers, has no bias in this case. He did not like Jose Menendez, and he told you that. And why would you, after all, like him? All right. This is Roger Smith's testimony, and he's talking about what is, I don't think I can, well, I have it here now. I'm going to go on this side so I don't block. I'm going to keep turning my back to. Okay, and he's asked, did he, meaning Jose Menendez, behave in an intimidating way? And his answer was absolutely. And what kind of behavior would you characterize as intimidating? Well, he had a very clear way of letting you know through a word, a gesture, a look, exactly how you were displeasing, that you were displeasing him, and would sort of, you learn to be fearful of getting one of those looks or gestures. And then he talks about the atmosphere of fearfulness at the company. And then he talks about the fact that Jose Menendez creates this total front of power. He is totally invulnerable. That's why he is such a really scary guy, that he will show no vulnerability, he will show no weakness. So his children get this picture of him as akin to God. I mean, he is strong, powerful, smart, fearless, absolutely fearless. He will never back down from anything. That's the person they're supposed to just up and walk out the door on. Okay, and Mr. Smith says, I formed an opinion based on direct statements by him that the worst thing you could ever do, and this was an occasional criticism of me, in other words, Jose is criticizing Roger because Roger is this way, was to show vulnerability, concern for the other person's point of view. And I asked, did he ever make a statement to you about his unwillingness to ever show his own weakness to anyone else? He never made a verbal statement, but I observed it constantly. And now we talked about how if Jose Menendez had not been killed, he was going to resign at the end of his contract, which was August 31st. And he talked about, to Roger Smith, his philosophy of management. And I submit to you, this is his philosophy of managing all subordinates, not just at work, but at home as well. And here is the point that I put this page down for. And he turned to me, said Mr. Smith, with a sort of smile and said, I've always thought, Roger, it was far better to be feared than be loved. And that does not surprise anyone who had to live with that man. Now I have another page here of descriptors of Mr. Menendez that people use. The ones we just went through are things that people saw him demonstrate when dealing with his children. But there also were people who described specifically what Mr. Menendez, what his parenting style, if you will, was like. And it doesn't sound a whole lot different than his work style, but of course, he's free to be completely over the top at home. And these are the descriptions of Jose Menendez as a parent. Dictatorial, sadistic, unrealistic, micromanager, harshly critical, emotionally harsh, a sick, obsessive dedication. Now, Mr. Curiano wants to reward him, or call it a positive quality, that he has absolutely no other interests in life besides his work and his boys. And I think that's really creepy. I mean, he has no friends, he has no hobbies, he has no interests except this incredibly intense and driven and over-involved enmeshment in the lives of his children. And one of his relatives described that as a sick, it was his sister, Martha, obsessive dedication. This is not just a healthy interest in seeing that his children get the best. Every single witness, the prosecutors got up and said, well, didn't he want what was best for his children? And nobody agreed with that statement. No, he wanted to live through his children. He wanted what was best for him from his children. He didn't care if it was best for them. Did he ever ask them what do they want? Did he ever try to figure out what's best for them? He already knew the answer. Be me. Or do what I do. He was described by some of the coaches as the worst parent, a problem parent, controlling every aspect of their lives. His sons could never do enough for him. He was businesslike, overbearing, not praising, supportive, or kind, and called them names. Now, Mr. Curiano said it's hard to be a parent. No, it's hard to be a perfect parent. In fact, nobody can be a perfect parent. And I don't even know what that means, having tried and probably failed miserably long ago. You can't be a perfect parent. But you can be, as Bruno Bettelheim said, a reasonably decent parent and raise healthy enough, a good enough parent to raise healthy enough children and to just charge your duties and obligations to God, who gave you these kids. And you don't have to be brilliant and you don't have to be perfect. But you have to do a couple of things, just one or two, to be an okay parent. You have to respect that your children are not you. They are them. They are people. They are individuals. They hurt if you hurt them. They fear if you scare them. They suffer if you deny them love. And it wouldn't hurt in trying to be a parent if you were kind, nice to them once in a while. And none of that, not even nice, happened in this family. So you can say, as Mr. Kuriyama may in his remaining argument, oh, there are much worse cases of child abuse. There are children burned with cigarettes and their hair on fire and locked in closets, and they don't kill their parents. And my answer to that is some of them do. And yes, there are worse cases, individual cases of physical torture.
Some of them probably would if they had the chance, but didn't have the chance.
And that's a terrible thing, but physical torture is not the only form of devastating, crippling, arresting developmental child abuse.
Yep.
And you show me a worse case of sexual molestation than the sadistic version that Jose Menendez imposed on Erik. Where, no, it wasn't even pleasure. By the time Erik was a teenager, Jose only did it as punishment and control. Because, you know, abused kids, as they get older, they're a little harder to hold on to than when they're little guys and you can terrify them. When they get older, they go to school. You know, there are maybe they can learn something out there about you and that you're wrong, okay? So typically, when abused kids hit teenage, the parents rein them in even more. And here what happens is, the time when the sex becomes really painful and violent is when Erik is in puberty, when he's starting to doubt that this is normal. And this persists through his teenage years, so that by the time he's 18, these acts are pure punishment to continue to show Erik what sadly was true. I'm still in control, and I don't care how big you are, you can't define me. I own you. You're just the little planet, and I am still the sun, and you can't break free of my gravitational field, and that is absolutely emotionally true. But Jose was very clever at how to manipulate and control people. Next up, this would be a good time for a break.
And we'll
I have flipped the chart now so that it lists the descriptions of Mary Louise Menendez again. Here. Only things that I put up there were things that at least 2 or more people said. Mr. Kuriyama told you that Perry Berman described her as a sweet, caring lady, and that Perry Berman was a very...
Kitty, in case you didn't hear, because it was hard to hear. She said these are descriptions of Mary Louise Menendez. That's Kitty.
Good friend of Erik Menendez, but of course he wasn't. He was just another one of the tennis coaches who had been jumped on by Jose Menendez, who described Jose Menendez as the worst parent, as doing things that no other tennis parent ever did, running onto the court and yelling at him because he wasn't working Erik hard enough. And Perry Berman talked about having visited the family in Beverly Hills, and he made his comment that Mary Louise Menendez was sweet and caring. I'm not sure what she cared about, but unquestionably she could be sweet. She was also described as charming and fun to be with and a great conversationalist in the middle of these Monopoly games and bridge games and other games when she was cheating all the time. And I want to say something before I go through these lists of Mrs. Menendez's personality, or character, if you will, about the people who came here to testify. Now, a large number of family members came here to testify, cousins and sisters and brothers. And it wasn't easy for them to do that for a number of reasons. And I can think of several. First of all, as you know, even though you've been forbidden to participate in it, this is a televised trial, and it's televised nationally. And that makes people very tense and frightened when they have to come to testify. But beyond that, think about, in your own lives, getting on national television and saying negative things about your own family and speaking ill of the dead. And these were people who the witnesses that we brought loved. Now, they didn't all love both of them equally, but they did care about these people. And it is not inconceivable that even though they saw, and they clearly saw, a very abusive family environment with which they did not interfere, they nevertheless felt a great deal for both Jose and Mary Louise Menendez. And so it was not easy for them to come here and testify. And with respect to the children of the family who came, although they are adults now, and told you the stories of their interaction with this family during their childhoods, I think you could see it was a very emotionally difficult experience. We're talking about Alan Anderson, Brian's son, and Kathy Simonton, Joan's daughter, and Diane Vandermolen, Joan's other daughter, and Mary Ann Cano, Martha's daughter. And these were the children who spent time in the home of Jose and Mary Louise Menendez, and virtually every one of them was damaged by the experience. Kathy talked about how she had to leave early, how the atmosphere was so oppressive, how she learned to try to make herself invisible because that was the only way to survive in this family, how her own sense of herself, and she was 15 years old and she only spent a couple of months there, was damaged and reduced in the period of time she lived around these people. They made her feel so badly about herself. And she was 15. And Diane Vandermolen, who first had a good experience at that home when the children were very small. And then when she went back, there had been this dramatic change. And she too felt that she was treated badly and her sense of herself was destroyed. And ultimately, of course, she was thrown out of the family circle because she had the effrontery to become pregnant out of wedlock. And Mrs. Menendez, of course, would never tolerate such a scandal. What would the neighbors, after all, think of such a thing? And when these... members of Erik's family who are his first cousins and his peers came to testify, I think you saw that even for them, this was a frightening and emotional experience. But they came, and I think they came and they gave you the most insightful information because they could relate better than the grown-ups to what it was like to be a child of that family. But it was not an easy thing, and it was not an expected thing. I mean, to just say flat out, oh, these two children killed their parents, therefore all their relatives will rally around them? No. They rallied around them because they know that what we're proving here is true. They are the source of the facts. They rallied around them because they know what Erik is like, and he was not arrogant, and he was not vicious, and he was not cold-blooded. And we'll get to the chart that has the descriptions of Erik on it soon. And they love him. And they don't love him blindly. They love him because they know what happened to him. And they came, I think, because they felt responsible. And it wasn't their fault. And I can't imagine anyone who could have stopped the rolling freight train of Kitty and Jose Menendez and derailed them from their course of child rearing. And the few people who tried, when Martha, who had been a nursery school teacher, a preschool teacher for 14 years, when she is at this family gathering in Muncie, and she tried, and here she is, and here's Kitty smiling at the camera, as she always does, and here's Erik, and here's Lyle, sad and morose, as he always was, and here's Jose, the proud head of the family. And when she is there, and she tries to tell them, do not grab and terrify Erik, do not be physical with him that way, and he starts to cry. Do not banish him to his room because he's crying because you frightened him, and have a 2-year-old alone in his room for the rest of the day. That isn't appropriate child rearing. She is first humiliated and mocked by Jose Menendez. Oh, what books have you read, Martha? This is the man who's the expert at everything. What books have you read that tell you this is wrong, what we're doing? And he completely dismisses her, and Kitty Menendez laughs. So they do try as best they can, these relatives who are really kept away from these children, even when they live close by. And of course, at that time, Martha, who's clearly the second strongest member of that family, is living in Puerto Rico, and she has 5 children. At that time, she has 4. And what is she supposed to do in order to stop what's happening in the family? And she testifies she doesn't even get to know Erik very well until after the parents are killed, and they can no longer keep her away, because she talks about how when Erik is around 12, she's told she can't come to his sports competitions anymore. And this is just more evidence, and there's a tremendous amount of it here, of them isolating the children and keeping away other adults who could give them a different view of the world, who could help these children question what's going on in their family, which they're otherwise unable to do. And then we have Terry and Carlos Baralt, who are extremely sweet people and nice people, and I think it must be quite pleasant to be one of their 4 daughters. But they were not the parents of Erik and Lyle Menendez, and they had no independent relationship with Erik at any time, not before nor after even the parents died, although they had a relationship with Lyle. And particularly Terry was very, very nervous as a witness. And these are the people who lived closest. And I think, in looking at their testimony, I think they must feel very, very badly that they couldn't have done more. And yet even they tried, and they're quite meek and mild people. They couldn't hold a candle to Jose and Kitty when it comes to personal strength. And they tried to tell them, wait a minute, when, for example, Kitty is leaving Erik alone all the time, or losing the children at the mall. Terry says to her, this isn't right, let's go get the kids, they're lost at the mall. Oh no, now I know where they are, I can continue shopping, without any thought of what a child who's lost feels like, how anxious and frightened they are, or what a child feels like who's sitting in the security office at the mall for 2 hours, knowing their mother's been paged, and knowing she doesn't care. She isn't going to come. And what kind of kids are they? They sit there like little soldiers for 2 hours. You don't ever hear that they were so disruptive that the security guards had to go and find mother. They just sit there obediently with an abandoning mother and wait, because eventually she'll be done buying shoes and we'll come get them. And Terry sees this, and it bothers her, and she says something about it, and it gets her nowhere. And Carlos sees this philosophy of this family. Winning is all that matters. You do not value your kids if they do anything less than bring home the trophy. Winning is all that counts. They will never measure up unless they're number 1. And Carlos, how sick that is. How destructive that is of any notion the child might ever have of being a worthy human being. And he says he tries over the years to tell Jose, don't do that. And of course he's mocked and ignored like everyone else. But I think in spite of their efforts, I think they feel now if they had only known everything. And they saw a lot. But sometimes you don't see what's right under your nose. And let me give you the biggest example. This photograph. This photograph was featured in the Los Angeles Times. Right, I think it was in July no, it wasn't July, it was October of 1989. They did this whole story about the homicides, and some of you, when we were talking to you in jury selection, had even seen that. It's right there, it's reprinted. His hand is in his child's crotch. Now, that doesn't prove he's molesting, but it proves he owns them. He can put his hands anywhere. And the family's all around. This is a family gathering. This is when Erik has this thing on his face that nobody can remember. And here they are. And here's Terry. And here's Carlos. And here are their 4 daughters. And here's Mary Louise Menendez. And this is little Peter Cano. And here's Lyle. And here's Erik. And everybody's there, and they don't see it, because they can't conceive that their family is sick. And nobody wants to believe that. And it's a weird picture, and he's so happy with himself, Mr. Menendez. And here's Erik, smiling at his big brother, who he idolizes. And here's Erik with this mark on his face. And here's Erik with Terry and Carlos's 4 daughters. And now the smile seems a little forced. Erik of the million smiles. And no one even asks, what's on his face? How does it get there? They don't even remember it. And why should they remember it? If you remember the testimony of Faith Goldsmith, these kids were hurt all the time, and hardly a surprise since their mother will not protect them. Faith testifies about, I didn't put that particular picture here. She testifies about in the Muncie house, there's a railing, and you will see it. They had an outdoor deck, and the deck is on the second story, and it has a railing up above it. And Lyle is 5 years old, and he's walking along this deck, and Mary Louise could care less if a kid falls and breaks his head. Oh, he won't fall. She's very brave for her children's health. And so they're hurt a lot because no one is taking care of them, and nobody notices. It's, oh, they're boys. And that's a theme that runs through this trial from the prosecution side, and a theme that I'm happy to say both Faith Goldsmith and Terry Baralt refused to buy into, and they were very firm about it. Little boys suffer as much as little girls. Little boys need love and support and comforting and nurturing as much as girls. And when little boys are sexually molested, it is just as horrific, if not more so, than girls. Miss Lansing asked something in her final argument, and I'll ask you the same question. Would you feel any differently about what happened to my client if my client's name was Erika Menendez? Would it make any difference to you if he was a girl who was sadistically sexually molested by her father? Because if it would, it shouldn't. Because men are human, and boys are human, and men and women suffer, and boys and girls suffer, and it is no different. And the only difference is something that every single one of you, all of you, including the alternate jurors, understood and acknowledged in the juror questionnaire. We asked you 2 questions. One of them was, do you think there's, and I haven't looked at it recently. I mean, I've had your answers given to me by Ms. Morrissey, who did the legwork, but the question was, do you think that boys have a greater reluctance to report sexual abuse? And you all said, yes, you do. And you were asked, why do you think that? And you all understood there is this sexist sexual stigma in our society, a cultural stigma that men are supposed to be brave and they're not supposed to be victims. And that makes it hard, as Dr. Briere testified, as Dr. Burgess testified, as Dr. Tyler testified, it makes it twice as hard for little boys not only to report what's happening, but to feel that what's happening to them is wrong. Boys are not supposed to be victims. Girls can be victims. And certainly in this family, boys are supposed to be braver than brave and tougher than tough and more fearless than fearless. So that was one question you answered. And the other question you answered was whether you should blame the victim. Whether if a boy, even a teenage boy, is being sexually molested, is it his fault? And every one of you answered, no, you can never blame the victim. Now, I suggest to you that in his closing argument, Mr. Kuriyama is going to make a revolting suggestion. And I'm not going to tell you what it is, but stay awake during his argument and listen for it. And this revolting suggestion is akin to blaming the victim for what happened here. Okay. I have put on the board the descriptions of, I have explained to you, I hope, what some of the conflicts that this family felt and how extraordinary it is that they were willing to come here, and that the only reason they were willing to do that is they know their nephews and they know their cousins in a way that unfortunately you never can, because you can't really know someone through their testimony, and you can't sit down and talk to them. It's against the rules. These are the descriptions that people gave of Mary Louise Menendez. And it starts way, way back. It starts before she even has children. Faith and Peter Goldsmith are their friends, and Faith is the first person who describes her as extremely competitive. And then we have immense temper, which is a descriptor that Alan Anderson gave. Mesmerized, and going back even to when the family is living in Muncie. And remember, Erik is born in 1970. He's 2 years old when they leave Muncie. This little photograph is taken when they're living at Muncie. So are these. This is Hinsdale, but these are Muncie. This is Muncie. And even when they're living there, she has this tendency to space out, to suddenly be lost, to seem to be reacting to a set of emotions that have nothing to do with what's going on around her. Both her rages, and Alan described her throwing all this glassware in the sink, breaking all these things that would start for no reason and end for no reason, and her spacing out. She is not well. And the significance of that is not that she's not well, but that her children cannot possibly know what to expect from her. She cannot be apart from her behavior towards them, she has got to be an unsettling figure in their life. You don't know what to expect from mother because she behaves in ways that have nothing to do with what I do. And a person who feels that way, if you live with a person like that, you feel really helpless. And you feel unable to affect that person, unable to influence what they do to you. Non-interfering refers to the fact that she never would stop Jose from doing the things he did to the kids. Enraged, angry, sarcastic, hostile. You may remember the testimony of the coach, Charles Wadlington, who saw much more of her than he saw of Jose Menendez, because she would sit there. And this, on the surface, looks like great dedication, but when you analyze it, is great obsessiveness. She would sit there through these long, 6-hour tennis practices while Charles Wadlington is working with the kids, and he says he saw Mr. Menendez was only there occasionally. She was there every time. And he saw her unremittingly hostile and sarcastic to the kids. Never positive, never nice. He is the person who said he personally never saw her smile. Private and secretive. And secretive is a critical word in this case. It is not just that the children had to be secretive. It's that the entire family was masked in this veil of secrecy. They projected a certain public image which fit their need for status and to be viewed a certain way. And what was going on inside that family never left the doors of their houses, whichever house it was. And she was the most secretive of the secret. They called her brother, Brian Anderson, to testify. And Mr. Anderson told you he was the closest person in the world to his sister, and she confided in him. And then we went through the litany of all the things he didn't know. And it was obvious that she didn't tell him any more than she told anyone else. She told no one what was going on in this family. She said to him, I have an infidelity problem. Period. Not, I'm suicidal, I'm depressed, I'm miserable, he's been cheating on me for 8 years, I went to New York, I tracked the woman down, I spoke to her, I took her photograph, I think about her day and night, I have panic attacks about it, I've been in therapy 3 years, I can't get past this, it's the be-all and end-all of my life. None of it. No medication. No suicide thoughts, no sitting in the bathtub with a razor, no taking too many pills and winding up at the hospital, no constant thoughts of suicide for 2 years, none of it. And to no one was there ever said, the boys are not doing well, Erik has learning disabilities, Lyle wets his bed. None of the negative things ever came out because this was the perfect American success story. This was the perfect family. And they are the perfect parents, and they are creating the perfect products. And no one is allowed to know that these are normal children at birth with normal children limitations that they are distorting beyond recognition. And that Erik grows up with tremendous disabilities to overcome. And not only are those disabilities not treated, they're not acknowledged. And he does overcome most of them. The fact that he gets into college, the fact that he does well at the SAT is being held against him. Can you imagine the work it took for him to be able to perform that way in order to meet his parents' expectations? But of course he wasn't good enough for them because he wasn't perfect. I wanted to bring the crime scene to the foyer. Thank you. And so secretiveness is important because secretiveness is reinforced with the children. They know their parents don't talk. They are instructed. One of the cousins testified, I think it was Diane, that when they went over to other relatives' house, be sure not to talk about anything going on in here. Be sure not to talk about your grades or your schoolwork or any problems. Now, the prosecution may argue there couldn't have been sexual molestation going on here because, after all, they had all these different cousins living in their house. Yes, and these are the cousins who tell you that when Jose Menendez walks into the bedroom with either of his sons, no one else is allowed to even go down the hallway. No one listens at the door. No one goes in. No one sees what he does. Diane Vandermolen testified that when she was living in the house, there would be occasions when Jose Menendez would be alone with Erik in his room. And the only place he ever was alone with Erik was in Erik's bedroom. And even Ed Fenno, fast forward years later, Beverly Hills house. Where is Jose Menendez ever alone with Erik? In Erik's bedroom. This is not number one son who gets 3-hour knee-to-knee head-to-head lectures in the basement or in the family room or in the green room at Pennington or in the paneled study at the Beverly Hills house. No, there are no conversations ever between Jose Menendez and Erik Menendez that are witnessed by other people. They are only in his bedroom. And Diane Vandermolen testifies there would be occasions when, after one of these little private things in Erik's bedroom, Jose Menendez would come down to dinner. These are before dinner, and Erik testified he was molested usually before dinner. He would come down to dinner and say, Erik's not feeling well, or Erik's upset. He won't be coming to dinner tonight. And where else did we hear that? Fast forward to Kalamazoo, and we have Pat Anderson, who the prosecution quote from, even though her version of what she saw is completely different than the witness they called, Brian Anderson. We fast forward to Kalamazoo, and Pat Anderson says, this is not the last game he lost, by the way. You may not remember this from Erik's testimony, but Brian makes it clear he's not there. They're not there at the end of the Kalamazoo tournament. This is the penultimate loss. This is the day before, when he loses, and he's frustrated, and he's been harangued by his father, and he says the aggressive words, shut up. And what happens is after he loses here, Jose goes off with him into his room. And the rest of the family is waiting to go to dinner. And nobody goes to the room and knocks on the door. And Jose has a key to this room, we find out later. But they wait and they wait and they wait and they wait. And eventually, Jose comes out and says, Erik's upset. He won't be coming to dinner. And
Whoops, I was muted. I had to stop it for a second because what the hell? Jose has a key to Erik's bedroom. So even in his own bedroom, if he locks the doors, he's not safe. That's how scary this man is. And that's how terrified you can only imagine Erik would be because Jose could come in at any time, even if you lock the door. So, like, just beyond words, the amount of the level of maltreatment that these boys had to endure.
they walk back to the room, and Jose uses his key and opens the hotel room door and does not allow Pat to go in there, who wants to hug Erik because she feels so sorry for this
Oh, this is the hotel room. Okay, sorry. Back to it.
arrogant boy who is punishing himself and feeling horrible about himself because he has lost a tennis match. And she's not allowed to go in there, and they go off to dinner, and then Kitty disappears and goes back to her room for a while, and she rejoins them at dinner and is totally spaced out.
Think she was doing something? Think she went upstairs? Like, she probably knew that Jose was in Erik's room. Even though it is a hotel room, it's still kind of creepy that he has a key. Especially knowing what we know about Jose. So Jose's in Erik's room, and Kitty knows this, because Jose's not with her. So what do you think? She probably did some kind of whatever drug she was on that her therapist put her on. And then she came back out of the room real spacey. That's her way of not dealing with it. That's her way of hiding those emotions that she's feeling that her husband is a sicko.
So the fact that there were periodically these other kids who were completely controlled and humiliated and ridiculed, just like the boys were, living in their home was no threat to Jose Menendez and his secret. And now we're talking about these descriptions of Mary Louise Menendez, that she was status conscious and image conscious. You remember the testimony of her sister Joan saying how excited she was when the closing on the Beverly Hills house happened because she got her zip code. Remember the testimony of Dr. Cox. She's talking about her alcoholism, her dependency on alcohol, which she won't treat and she won't deal with and she won't go to programs because there's nothing wrong with her that her husband paying more attention to her won't fix in her mind. And she's talking to Dr. Cox about this problem that she won't deal with, and she brags to him that she's a cognac alcoholic. And as Dr. Cox testified, she seemed to think that gave her better status. She was described as dominant, as strong-willed, as physically strong. Now, the significance of that is you heard some allusions to this notion of the battered wife. And I think we've all been exposed in the popular press, even over the last few years, to notions of what is a battered wife. And we all picture this poor, pathetic, helpless woman who has been trained through her ineffectuality in trying to stop abuse. She has been trained to feel helpless, that there is nothing she can do. And that is the classic picture. And the prosecution has tried to make Mary Louise Menendez look like such a battered wife and such a victim. But you don't hear people who know her describe her that way. She is tough. She is strong. She beats up on Jose Menendez in front of Terry and Carlos Baral. She hits him. She fights back in private in ways she doesn't fight back in public. But more important, instead, the classic battered wife, let's take the typical battering family which happens to be more common, though not exclusively so. The batterer is the husband-father. And we have the poor victimized wife, and we usually also have the poor victimized kids. And there is in these families, however ineffectual these poor, weak women may be, there is a union and a joinder between them and the other victims, which are the kids. And even if she's ineffectual in really protecting the kids or stopping the battering, at least she acknowledges, children, we're all in this together. Children, you're right. Daddy got drunk and Daddy beat up on us, and I'm sorry and I wish I could stop it, but I'm scared too. And you never, ever, ever heard that that was how Mary Louise Menendez dealt with her children. Oh no. When Lyle goes to her, she is threatening to commit suicide. She leaves the letter on purpose for Erik to find, okay? And when he finds it, and he calls his brother, and he's hysterical, and he's upset, Lyle reaches out for his mother and says, Mother, come live with us. You and me and Erik will go live back east, get away from him. This is awful what he's done to you. And he has also humiliated her publicly for years, mocked her, made fun of her, put her down in front of the children, in front of the relatives. This is his sense of humor at work. And so Lyle offers her, be our mother, we'll be your sons, let's go off and get away from this guy. Oh no, there's nothing wrong with your father, you're the problem in this family. So far from the typical battered wife who sees that her children are being victimized as well, who offers them any kind of acknowledgement. You know, sometimes that's all it takes for an abused kid to survive. Just tell them, I know what you're going through, I'm sorry. No one ever said that to these kids. No one ever said that to Erik. Look at all the teachers who came here. Poor Erik, sad Erik, anxious Erik, pathetic Erik. You hear it over and over again because that's clearly what he was like. Did any of them ever say, Erik, I know what you're going through, and I'm sorry? No. Not only do they never stop, they never acknowledge it. So what does the kid think? He thinks that what's happening is what should be happening. He thinks it's his fault. He thinks this is normal because no one ever says, your parents are wrong and you're a victim. No one ever says it. And the last person in the world who's going to say it is Mary Louise Menendez, who spends far more time with her children than Jose does, and has far more opportunity to be nice to them and isn't, and therefore has far more opportunity to be unremittingly critical, hostile, nasty, unsupportive of both of them, but especially in ways that never applied to Lyle of Erik, because she decided that her learning disabled child was going to be fixed by her. She was going to teach him. And every single session over homework and every single session over teaching was just another excuse for her to go in a rage, to call him stupid and dummy and idiot and all the other words that she used. And that's what kind of battered wife she was. She was also disorganized. She was also reckless. And we talked a lot about, and you might have thought we're just nitpicking, about the dirt and the filth and the disorganization and her reckless driving and all the rest of it. And the point of that was not to make her look bad. The point of that was to show what utter chaos. There was order and structure and pressure and forced work on the one hand, and then there's chaos, always running late, never having clean clothes to put on the other. Where in this world does a child find a place of repose? Where is there a minute's peace? Where is there any source of feeling secure? None. Now, does that mean, oh, they're bad people then? No. But what do you turn into when you're a person where there's no peace, there's no comfort, there's no security, there's no support? You turn into a scared, anxious, nervous, fearful wreck. She was intimidating, in your face, frustrated, unhappy, clearly, and unwilling to do anything about it either. Critical, intelligent, capable, scary, aggressive, stubborn. Remember there was, it was Terry Baral who said you could not say no to her. If she wanted you to do something, you could not say no to her. And this came up in the context of when Jose and Mary Louise Menendez are buying Lyle a condominium to live in. The condominium that had 2 master suites so that when they went back east, they could live in one of them. And Mary Louise Menendez is very concerned. This is in the summer of 1989. He's long since broken off with Jamie Pisarcik, but she definitely does not want Lyle near Jamie Pisarcik. This is the girl who isn't high enough in social status for Mrs. Menendez to marry number one son. And so she's telling Terry that she wants her to have a key to she wants Terry to have a key to the condominium so she can run over there behind Lyle's back. This is the respect she shows her child, and check and make sure that that gold digger, Jamie Pisarcik, is not hanging around him anymore. Now, Ms. Pisarcik comes in here and testifies to a few truly remarkable things, but one of the things she claims is that that same summer, she and Mrs. Menendez are just thick as thieves. They're just the best of all friends, and Mrs. Menendez even allows her to use the telephone credit card for the specific purpose of Jamie and Lyle getting together at a tennis tournament. I just put that in your head because when I get to Jamie Pisarcik and her credibility, I think that's a very important point, that we know what Mrs. Menendez thought of Jamie. And it is inconceivable that she's trying to put Jamie back together with Lyle when she's telling Terry, go spy, make sure that gold digger isn't around my son anymore. But the point of this is Terry was very uncomfortable doing this, to spy on the kid, to sneak into his condominium. And she tried to refuse. And she said it was very hard to say no to Mary Louise Menendez. She would get her way no matter what. Now, she was also described as pathetic. And she cried for weeks and weeks and weeks after they first got to California when she first learned of the affair. And that is pathetic. It is pathetic that as an adult woman with a family and with a support system, she could not pull herself up and put her life together. That she wanted to see herself as a victim, and she certainly wanted her children to see her as a victim. And she blamed her children for her victimization, including Thursday night before she was shot. And we will talk about the significance of that in the next section. In any event, she was pathetic, right, and spaced out and tense and always late and in a hurry and intense and frightened of Jose sometimes, and incoherent and very nervous and depressed, clearly, and suicidal, yes, and very violent and screaming and very fearless and tough and self-confident and powerful and ascribed to the theory that you cheat to win. And she cheated all over the place. She lied about her age. She helped Erik get a false driver's license. She did their schoolwork for them. She cheated at games. She lied about her family. She was bright. She was a fun person. She was a good friend. She was confrontational and fierce and rigid and suspicious and confused and indecisive and bizarre and strange and some would say attractive. And I ask you, would you ever leave your child with this woman? Is this a mommy? And you heard Faith Goldsmith testify that she would frequently take care of Erik and Lyle when they were little, but never, ever, ever would she leave her children, her daughters, alone at Kitty Menendez's house. Now, I've also put together descriptions of Mary Louise Menendez as a parent. Hostile, cold, and they said more about what she didn't do than what she did do, because to a large extent her direct sins against her children were sins of omission. She didn't mother them. She wasn't a mother to them. She was not loving, not nurturing, not protective. She did have a total dedication, as did Jose, to their sports. She spoke abusively. She was not affectionate. She was not demonstrative. She was not praising, comforting, supportive, tender, or kind. She was overbearing. She was very defensive, because she's so defensive at the schools because they're not really separate people. It's not their failures. They're not the ones who cheat on a test or copy from the World Book or do any of that. It's hers, because they are an extension of her, just as they are for Jose. They are not independent people. And therefore, that is why she is so hooked into their performance. They're her objects. They belong to her. If they do well, she's done well. If they do badly, people would criticize her. That's why she never acknowledges them as people. She is overbearing, very defensive, and possessive. And let me show you this. I'll put it in the middle so you can all see it. This is a crime scene photograph. This is a photograph taken in the foyer through the double doors into the family room. And Mrs. Menendez's body is still on the floor in this picture. And I submit to you that to the only extent that her children ever meant anything to Mrs. Menendez, in the only way they were ever valuable to her, they are pictured in this photograph. Because along the top of the bookcase are their trophies. And all they ever meant to her were potential trophies. And all she ever valued them for were the trophies that they brought home. And how pathetically true that is proved by the prosecution calling Brian Anderson as a witness, her brother, who came here to do Erik harm, whatever his agenda may be, to do Erik harm, to do the prosecution some good. And he came here and he was asked, did you ever see your sister? And the word was ever. Show any affection for Erik. Oh yes, he said. When Erik was 18 years old at Louisville and he had just won in tennis, she hugged him. And that, folks, was it. And this man claims to have been around the family for years, although he doesn't even remember Erik existing when they lived in Hinsdale. He doesn't know the ages of his nephews. He was off by over 3 years. But he claims to be intimately connected to this family, and so he is asked, what signs of affection did she ever show? He's not asked, did she hug? What sign of affection did she ever show? Well, the little trophy won something. She was elated, he said. Yay, Erik, now you can exist. Lose and die. Win, and we are happy. And here he is. There's Erik, and there's Lyle, and that's all that mattered to them about Erik and Lyle. Win, and bring us glory, and bring us fame, and be our perfect little laboratory rats. Well, the problem is children don't always, and particularly children who are pressured the way these are and twisted the way these are, they don't always turn out to be little perfect products. I remember when I was in college, this whole notion of what it is to be a parent and what it is to be a child was brought home to me by a Spanish author named Miguel de Unamuno, who I unfortunately had to read in Spanish, which was quite a suffering project. But he wrote a story that was called The Walnut Tree. In the Spanish, I don't remember what walnut tree is. And it was a story about two brilliant, competitive, success-oriented young parents. A perfectly wonderful male and a perfectly beautiful female, and they were both professors of something or another, and they were great geniuses. And they, in a very rational and scientific way, decided to have a child, and this would be the perfect child, because they were the perfect parents. And so they gave birth to a child who was physically deformed, and who was not mentally bright in the way they wanted. His IQ was not 150. And they rejected him entirely. And so the only person that he could befriend, they were also very wealthy. They lived, I mean, it's weird how some things prefigure other things, but they were also very wealthy, and they lived on this vast estate. And the only person who would befriend this child was the gardener who harvested the walnuts from the walnut tree. And what the gardener discovered, which the parents wouldn't even look for, was that this child was a poetic genius, a person of tremendous sensitivity and feeling, who could write beautiful stories, and who by the end of the story, because he was unloved by his parents, hung himself from the walnut tree. And there they are, boys up on the wall, where they are valued by these people. What's most significant, however, about these parents, for your purposes, because moral judgments aside, you're here to solve this crime, is how they made their children feel about their lethality. This is a family where there's a lot of death on the table. Both of these parents behave in very extreme ways. Kitty Menendez has great rages and great despair. And she does things that are very extreme in her driving, for example, in her discipline, in getting attention. And Jose Menendez, of course, has extremely extreme behavior. And this is a family, therefore, where children are raised where the emotional meter, if you will, swings from one end of the scale all the way to another. And so when you're trying to judge what Erik Menendez did, you should keep in mind that his only examples were very extreme ones. But here are the things that his mother did all of his life to make him fearful as a person, afraid of her and afraid in general, constantly exposing him to danger. Now these people, let's assume they were sincere for the moment. They have this really what we call cockamamie idea that if you have a basically frightened and timid child, which is what Erik was as a little kid, the way you make him brave and strong is you scare the hell out of him. Well, the problem is it doesn't work. As we know, as I'm sure you all knew, and you didn't need Dr. Burgess to tell you, when you frighten people over and over again, they do not get over fear. They become more and more fearful because you keep telling them bad things are going to happen by doing this. And so she exposes her kids to danger, and they feel, therefore, Erik feels endangered. She calls him stupid and dummy and baby and sissy when he's frightened. He isn't entitled to that feeling, and yet he gets no comfort for it. And if you don't get comfort for being afraid, if you're not made secure, if you're not told they're there, honey, it's okay. There's no monster under the bed. And if there were, Mommy wouldn't let him eat you. Oh no, he's not told that. They create monsters to frighten him. They put witch masks in the closet. So the child who's having these 2 and 3 month long daily horrible nightmares can then be encouraged, oh, Erik, go to the closet. And he does, and the mask drops, and his mother laughs, and his father bursts out laughing, and all he knows is these people like me to be afraid. These people will never deal with my fear. They just scare him all the time. And she sends him to his room without food and without the ability to go to the bathroom, so he knows he can never go to her for his needs. And she abandons him at airports, at malls, at the swimming pool all day long. And he is left home alone, and once he's left home alone in a storm and the lights go out, and he is frightened of the dark, and he calls his Aunt Terry, and he speaks to his cousin Sylvia, who is the oldest of Terry's daughters here. And Sylvia drives over there and keeps her little cousin company. And when Kitty Menendez finds out that a child of hers has shown weakness, she gets very upset, and Erik never calls Terry's house again. And yet, Terry knows he's left home alone a lot. He's left home alone when he's 5 in Muncie, and he hits the road looking for his mother, who's gone off with Lyle. And she constantly engages in this reckless and dangerous driving that scares her kids. She doesn't put them in a belt. She doesn't bother with infant seats. After all, they got to be tough. And she has these constant rages that frighten them into never knowing what is she going to do at any given moment. And she is hard on them, and she enforces Jose's program down the line. She is no different than he is when it comes to this abusive pressure. And she certainly is no different when it comes to physical punishment and allowing them to be frightened, because she does it herself as well as go along with Jose's. And then she does something even worse. It's not just that she reports their behavior to Jose for punishment. Lots of us have done that. Well, I tell your father. It's not approved of these days in child rearing that you should use one parent as the ogre so that you can be the good guy, like mothers used to do a lot. But this is different, because what she does is she reports lies. If she has screwed up, if the boys haven't listened to her in the way that she wants them to, she lies to Jose and says they did something wrong. And they get punished with the belt or worse. And she doesn't. And that's the way she avoids getting yelled at, or she avoids getting punished. She refuses to intervene when she's asked to protect them, and specifically, I'm thinking here of what Diane Vandermolen testified to, that Lyle comes to her and tells her something is happening between him and Jose, and he wants it to stop. And she goes to Kitty, and now the typical incest mother takes over, and she goes into major league denial. And she tells her children, I wish you were never born. Now, a lot of parents say a lot of things to their kids all the time. You know, I remember hearing, I hope you have 10 just like you. I wouldn't have minded having 10. I don't think I would have won. I think my mom was right on that one. But we all hear that. Or, God, you drive me crazy. Or, I'll kill you if you do that. We all hear that. And a lot of that is fine. I mean, it's not the best way to talk to kids, but you don't have to be perfect. You have to be human. But it's different what happens in this family because she really means it, and they know it because she says it to other people too. I wish you wouldn't. She doesn't just say, "Oh, I wish you were never born. You drive me crazy." Oh no, I wish you were never born because you've ruined my life. I could have had a life but for you, and you've taken your father or my husband away from me, and I have no life because of you, and you're the cause of all of my problems. And she says it over and over again, and he believes it. So he has no value to Mother. He's the cause of all of her problems. She's going to protect his life. She's going to want him to stay in his life when he is threatening to expose her to the least status-conscious charge in the entire world. The Beverly Hills social climber is going to be revealed as an incest wife. Sure, she's going to let that happen. I've talked about the mask in the closet. This is part of her and Jose's fear training. These people have all kinds of interesting theories of child rearing. And along with the mask in the closet, of course, she locks Erik in the basement so his father can play ghost and truly terrify him. She slaps him in the face. She slaps him in the face when he bites his nails. Some parents do that, but she does it over and over and over again. She kicks him. There's an episode I think he testified to when she's upset with the dog and he tries to stop it, so he gets kicked. She pulls his hair. Her idea of educational training and getting the best education possible for her child is to put him in a closet to do his homework and let him take a plastic container in there to take care of his biological needs. She puts him in cold water to deal with his nightmares. She knows this is a kid terrorized by nightmares, so of course add another level of terror to it. She blames him when she's at fault. We've talked about that a little. He told you the story about when she forgets his rackets and he's going to lose and he's going to get a beating because he's lost the tennis match, and she knows it, and she tells him, "Too bad. You don't think I'm going to tell Dad that I made a mistake." She screams, "I hate you," all the time. She means it. They know she means it. She leaves a suicide letter for him as an act of utter disdain for the feelings of her child. And what that also tells her child is, as I said before, death is on the table in this family. These people talk about killing. She talks about killing herself. If you know that you're dealing with a person who is seriously contemplating killing themselves and who has been hostile and aggressive towards you all your life, are you really so unreasonable in thinking maybe they wouldn't mind if you died too? And of course, she threatens to poison the family. And we know this is true not because Erik testified to it or Lyle testified to it, because of what Tracy Baker saw, where they left the dinner table. And then, of course, the very scariest thing of all happens on Thursday night before she is killed, when she tells her son what he never, ever, ever, ever wanted to believe, that she knew all along what was being done to him and she didn't care. Now, that is the single most terrifying thing she ever did. And why is it scary? Because in spite of everything else that she ever did, the children find a way, somehow, to live with her. Well, watch out for this and watch out for that and watch all the time and be hypervigilant and do the best you can to please her and bake her cakes and vacuum the floor and go out of your way not to make her crazy. Fine. But this is the one thing that completely destroys Erik's notion of his mother, who he has felt sorry for. She, after all, is the official sanctioned family victim. And he has gone along with that myth by feeling sorry for her. And now he finds out about betrayal of the worst kind. Now, if she could let that happen to you, why wouldn't she kill you? If she could let that happen when she is supposedly the victim and you've tried your best to be nice to her, why wouldn't she kill you? And maybe you or I would say, "Oh no, but she wouldn't," because we want to believe she wouldn't. But he had no reason whatsoever, no reason to believe that she wouldn't. Now, obviously, and I'm not going to go through this because Jose is a more obvious case. Everything Jose Menendez ever did with respect to his children was with the purpose of inducing fear. That's how he rules, by fear. So here is the list. Lyle testified that he would smack Erik aside. This is number 2. He doesn't count. Moreover, he doesn't look like him, does he? Lyle looks like Jose Menendez. He has his coloring. He has his look. Erik is blonde, and he's blue-eyed, and he's smiley, and he's emotional. He's a little more like Mom. Moms are second-rate, women are second-best, and second sons don't count. So he smacks him aside. He goes through a very similar episode of being nearly drowned in the swimming pool, which scares you, you know. He's beaten. He witnesses the beating of his mother. So does cousin Alan, who, although he doesn't see it, he hears it and he sees the bruises later. He's banished, removed from father, this glowing son whose love he wants if he cries. And then we have the wonderful story of how he is taught to ride a bicycle. And I have a picture here of the cul-de-sac in which he is taught to ride his bicycle. And one of the corny ways of saying to you what I don't know if I can get this up any higher, though, because it's on this styrofoam stuff. See, it's easier to load a shotgun than to mount a picture instead. Okay. No, it's not going to work. I'm going to hold it in front of you so you can see it. One of the cornier ways to say what it is we really would ask you to do, I'd ask you to indulge me and to indulge Erik as you're deliberating in this case, and to just try to conceive. Because I can tell that some of you are very resistant to what I'm saying. I mean, I'm not blind, I'm not stupid. But you owe us as jurors one thing only, that you must entertain the possibility that we're telling the truth. And you must also do one other thing. You must try, however foreign to you it may be, to put yourself in Erik Menendez's shoes, not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically as well, in order to understand if he did what he did for the reasons we say he did. Now, Jill Lansing and I have been representing Erik and Lyle, respectively, for well over 3 years. And in order to understand this family and to understand them, we tried to put ourselves in their shoes physically, and we went everywhere. And we went to all the houses they ever lived in, with the exception of Cedar Grove. And we walked the streets, therefore, where these things that we had heard about happened. It was a very eerie experience. But here I am, in the cul-de-sac, in Muncie, where Erik was tortured into riding a bicycle. And his cousin Alan Anderson was there and watched. And Dr. Kerry English testified to the scar that was untreated and that remains. And Erik testified to his recollection of this episode. And this was a demonstration not just of Jose Menendez's sadistic way of teaching things, but of Mary Louise Menendez's total and complete agreement. Because Erik is on this bike and he's being pushed down the hill, and this is the hill, from his house in Muncie into a cul-de-sac. And he has to make the turn without falling off if this 6-year-old kid gets to keep his birthday present bicycle. And if he doesn't make the turn without falling off, he is ridiculed and humiliated by an angry father who then throws the bicycle in the garage and doesn't let him go near it. And Alan sees this happen, and he sees and he sees Erik being pushed, and Erik is clinging for dear life, and he's screaming, and he's crying, and he's hysterical, and he goes down into the cul-de-sac, and he falls off. And Erik tells you that he had 5 turns to make it, and so on the 5th turn, he didn't jump off onto the grass, he stayed on the bike, and he fell, and he tore open his elbow. And Alan leaps to his feet, because Alan is a normal human being, and he wants to go down the hill and see how Erik is, because Jose is just ranting and raving in anger at this failure of a 6-year-old. And Mary Louise Menendez stops Alan. And she doesn't comfort Erik, and she doesn't get a medical treatment for this ripped open arm either. I guess if you take him for medical treatment for all the things that happen to these boys, some doctor might want to start wondering if this isn't a child abuse situation. So that was how Jose Menendez trained his child on the bicycle. He wouldn't catch him on purpose. That was his lesson in trust that I talked about. He would leave him screaming in a cemetery. Now, you know, in the prosecution, we talk a lot about lying here because one of the appalling realities, and I will share my insider knowledge of this with you, one of the appalling truths of criminal trials is that a lot of people come in here, take the oath, get on the witness stand, and lie. And it's horrible, because there's a lot at stake in every one of these cases. And it is truly disgusting how many people come to court and lie. And there are a lot of them that do it, and a lot of people did it here. And so we get into these long debates about who's lying and what are they lying about, and blah, blah, blah. And of course, Mr. Kuriyama is going to tell you and has told you Erik Menendez lies about everything. That's what he wants you to believe. And therefore, why this happened and why it happened, when it happened, is just a mystery up there in the ether. But my point is always this. When someone is accusing a defendant, who in spite of all of the instructions, who in spite of the presumption of innocence and all the rest of them, a defendant is always viewed as a witness with greater suspicion. In spite of everything that you know and understand and all of your answers on the juror questionnaire, in the very ugly way, defendants are presumed guilty. And they got to prove themselves and prove themselves and prove themselves. And so 10 days on the witness stand, he does his job, okay? And he's now accused of lying. If he was such a liar, and he's telling the stories of his childhood, how come he doesn't tell you all the really bad ones? He knows that Faith Goldsmith's going to testify that he was left in the cemetery to scream, and that's a pretty awful thing to do to a little kid. He doesn't remember it, so he doesn't tell you that. He knows that other witnesses are going to testify too. He knows about the jumping from the counter and falling smack on his face. He knows Uncle Carlos knows about it. He knows his brother knows about it. He knows other family members, as he said, know about it. But he doesn't remember it, so he doesn't testify to it. And he testified he didn't remember it.
Okay, objection is overruled, but again, ladies and gentlemen, just a reminder that the lawyers are commenting on the evidence. Your recollection might be different or might be the same, and you are the final judges of the evidence in this case. You may proceed.
Thank you. And that's what he said. He didn't remember that episode, although he knows that others know about it. And the same is true of the cemetery. And then we have the episode of scaring in the basement, which he does remember. And we have the episode of Jose pretending to be a burglar outside the door to scare his kids, like Lyle testified to. And then we have the molestation, which I will get to separately. And we have this other game that Jose's a real practical joker. He has a really sadistic sense of humor. He thinks it's funny to lock his kids in the shower, to either hold the door closed or stand in front of it and then take the wrench that controls the hot and cold and turn it all the way to hot or all the way to cold. Fun with kids. And then there's his threats, which are the more obvious fear-inducing behaviors of Jose, how he will kill Erik if he tries to run away, how he will beat him to death in a chair if he ever tells, how he uses the mirror ritual of Erik in front of a mirror, having to smack himself in order to instill in the child the fact that this is a secret that must never be told. How he forces, he thinks it's also amusing to throw Erik into the lake after he's told him it's full of snapping turtles and to make him swim to the other shore. And even though the kid thinks he's going to drown and cries for help, he gets enraged when Lyle jumps in and rescues him. And on and on. Throws him through a window, throws him against a tennis court fence, his harshness, his cruelty about the sports, his actual overt threat with a knife. And that occurs when Erik is 17 years old. And he told you that was the time when he, out of a sense of self-respect and a need to do something for himself, had the effrontery to say no when his father came into his room, and his reward for that was a knife at his throat and a sex act. And then, of course, there's the fact that his father, right in front of him, and everybody else who'll hear it, threatens to kill Craig Signorelli in a significant way, and in a way that the people who heard it, such as Ed Fenno, thought was for real. And then, of course, there's Jose sharing his basic philosophy that you lure and seduce people into a false sense of security, and then you strike. And his example of that was how to handle the Chinese Revolution in Tiananmen Square. Now, I want to go through some of the witnesses that were called in order to help you understand that when Erik says he was frightened and anxious over the course of the last week, he's not making something up. And why don't we start with the prosecution witness, Robert Anderson. Robert Anderson was a captain on the shark fishing boat. I'll talk about basically the shark fishing expedition in Mount Walker later on, but what's significant about Mr. Anderson's testimony is here he is a perfect stranger, and yet when he describes the behavior of Erik and Lyle on this boat, it is very obvious from day one of this trial that Erik and Lyle are afraid of their parents because what are they doing? When they first leave Marina Del Rey, he says, we actually took a wave over the front of the boat that soaked them. And we were on top of the fly bridge, and we didn't get wet. He's meaning himself and the rest of the crew. And yet we were even cold, and we weren't soaked. And they're wearing shorts, and he can't understand why they're staying up there. And if you remember, he testifies they stay at the front of the boat, huddled together, freezing cold, getting wet for the entire trip. And their testimony was that they thought, in reading the signs of these particular parents, that when they changed the time of the boat trip, which they found out about Friday night, that the boat trip had been changed from 11 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon, they saw that as a very ominous sign. And it's proven, I think we actually found the records that show the boat trip act. Oh, Mr. Anderson himself knows. The time of the boat trip really was changed at the last minute, and therefore, when Erik tells you he finds this out Friday night and it frightens him, he's telling you the truth. So here they are on the boat trip where they're thinking something's going to happen, and he's describing the family. He said, what did you observe about the interaction of this family? Did they seem to be happy and getting along? How did they appear? He says they were very actually apart during the trip. The sons were up front. Jose was either in the stern of the boat or down below with Kitty. There wasn't very much interaction going on, verbal interaction going on. Now that's their first witness to talk about this family. And then of course you heard the testimony, let's skip that, of Perry Berman. And he talks about how Jose would behave when he was training Erik and how upset and embarrassed Erik was when Jose jumped in there and said, make him work harder, this kid who never worked. And it was his opinion, knowing this family, this is Mr. Berman, and this is asked on cross-examination, that if there were any problems or secrets in this family, they would keep it to themselves. And he also said that this was a home where there was tension, that Jose ran his home like a company, and he was chairman of the board, and that he wanted control in every aspect of his son's lives. Now, maybe this is all a given to you now, but this is how the picture of these parents emerged, bit by bit, through every witness who knew them. Well, I think it's noon.
It is.
See, I was right.
And that's a perfect time to stop here. We're going to pick right back up where they leave off for part 3. This one's a little bit longer, so we're probably going to do it in 4 parts. However, the 4th part, I think we're going to do the reading of the verdict with it. So we'll combine that. So just look out for the next couple of episodes or streams. There'll be parts 3 and 4 should include the verdict reading. Hopefully we can squeeze that in. So thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know what you think. Please don't forget to hit the like button on your way out, and I will see you guys on Tuesday with part 3. Take care. Bye now.